"You can shave my head, but you can't shave away justice." In the courtroom, Dorothy Ellis turned humiliation into a hammer and smashed Brett Kellen's rotten police racket in just 3 minutes. And you has anyone in your state ever dared to go bald to protect justice? The night on Sutter Street has never been kind to anyone wearing a police badge, and Brett Kellen knows this better than anyone. Drizzle soaked the old brick walls in a damp, moldy sheen, bringing out the reek of cheap liquor and stale cigarette smoke that drifted through the narrow alleyways. The door to the cop-only bar stayed open, its dull yellow light spilling onto a pothole-riddled sidewalk like the gaping mouth of a city that had long devoured any real faith in justice. Brett sat alone at a table by the wall, far enough not to be dragged into the thick, coarse laughter of the young rookies crowding around the bar counter. The beer in front of him had long gone warm. Its foam had died away, leaving behind a pale yellow liquid glinting weakly under the dim lights. Murmurs from the next table drifted into his ears in scattered pieces, just enough to stitch together a dart that lodged deep into the swelling pride in his chest. Word is, tomorrow there's going to be a brand new judge, a black woman. They say she fought for civil rights, hates our guts. They say she's going to dig up old files. A young man's voice, eager as if he were about to watch a cheap circus act, clueless that to Brett, it sounded like a brazen provocation. He smirked, pinched the dying cigarette between his fingers, and flicked ash carelessly onto the damp tile floor. In his mind, the hazy face of this black lady judge appeared like slow prey, confident in her power seat, yet blind to who truly ran this pack of wolves. Brett had spent over 10 years on the force breaking down doors in the dead of night without warrants, shoving a black kid's head into a rain puddle just to teach him not to look a cop in the eye. Every stain in his record had been glossed over by the same hands who feasted at the same table of favors, so a woman black robe or gavel in hand couldn't mask the stench of real power, the kind Brett knew he held tight. He drained the warm beer slowly, letting the bitter taste blur down his throat, blending with the vile thoughts sprouting like weeds in his mind. The drizzle outside dragged on, like a sneer at the poor fools who still believed tomorrow would dawn with justice. He muttered, his voice nearly lost in the rain. "A black bitch on the highest bench? I'll teach you who gives the orders in this city." The metal chair scraped the floor, screeching. A few eyes flicked over, then quickly looked away when Brett stood, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the half-finished beer. He didn't bother glancing at the young cop staring at him with a mix of fear and disgust. Outside, the night was still long, and the drizzle would wash away any blood if need be. Out on the sidewalk, Brett pulled his collar high. The liquor and cold drizzle slapped his face awake, sharper than any coffee. Far ahead, headlights cut through the mist like the eyes of wild beasts flickering in a dark forest. He sneered. Everything was ready, just one more night to turn cowardly rumors into a permanent stain on the head of a fresh new judge. A rumble of thunder cracked in the distance. Brett quickened his pace, each step sinking into the rain-slicked pavement, leaving a dirty trail behind a sign of the brewing storm of hidden power about to explode. In his mind, one thought looped over and over. Tomorrow, Madam Justice, you'll bow before the wolf. The sky hadn't fully brightened, but the drizzle still clung to the car roof like fine dust coating the windshield streaked with old wipe marks. Inside, Brett Kellen slumped against the worn leather seat, a half-burnt cigarette between his fingers, ashes scattered across his uniform still unwashed from last night. His eyes, hollowed from a sleepless night, gleamed with a murky light, the same damp chill that always rose off Sutter Street when the weather turned. Resting on Brett's lap was a battered black notebook, stuffed with sticky notes and red lines crossing out names. He flipped to the last page, today's duty roster, the security team's positions, and, most importantly, details about the mystery woman, the one who'd sit the judge's bench for the first time in just a few hours. Brett drew deeply on his cigarette, smoke curling through his teeth, dissolving with a dry chuckle as he tapped a finger on the name Dorothy Ellis. He fished a crumpled scrap of paper from his inner pocket, the edges frayed, the sloppy signature faded, a special security check order. The last name at the bottom belonged to his old boss, retired since last year. probably vacationing somewhere with a young girlfriend. Brett sneered, stuffed the forged order back in his pocket, shut the notebook, and leaned forward to open the glove box. Inside, wrapped carelessly in a cloth bag, lay an old silver hair clipper, a leftover from an evidence locker cleanup. To Brett, it was a scalpel to peel off the noble mask these people paraded before the cameras. His finger traced the blade, chipped at one tooth but still sharp enough to shear someone's hair clean off in a few swift passes. Honor, he mouthed the word, lips twitching in a mock grin, while his eyes stayed dark as last night's rain puddle. In his mind, the judge appeared faintly, an old hag preaching justice but bound to bow in shame before the raw force Brett had always lived by. Yet even in that certainty, a bead of unease crawled under his collar like a drop of rain. This time was different. No one ordered him. No one promised to cover his tracks. If he slipped up, Brett knew the price. Losing his nameplate, his badge, maybe even his freedom. But that only made him more exhilarated. Nothing thrilled Brett more than the idea of personally crushing the symbol of justice in front of the crowd that saw him as a mad dog kept just loose enough to terrify the poor. A tap on the window startled him. Carl, the young rookie who'd been at the bar last night, leaned in, breath still carrying cheap coffee fumes. Brett, this order looks weird. Why not wait for the special unit? I think. Carl didn't finish. Brett flicked ash through the cracked window, growled like he was spitting phlegm. You just stand there. Keep your mouth shut. Want to live long? Play mute. Carl fell silent, backed off, eyes flicking with a mix of fear and disgust. Brett didn't care. He nudged the gas pedal. The patrol car shuddered forward toward the parking lot near the special detention wing, the place where witnesses under protection or certain guests were kept hidden from the press overnight. The headlights swept across a damp brick wall. Brett stepped out, filled his lungs with the stale human scent mixed with mold. The drizzle had stopped at some point, leaving only a few lingering drops falling from the rusted tin roof. He adjusted his uniform epaulets, smoothed his sleeve, and walked slowly toward the heavy steel door swinging open ahead. Behind that door, a lone figure sat on a wooden bench, black hair streaked with gray falling over her cheek. As Brett crossed the threshold, the woman lifted her head, eyes deep and still as a dry well, staring at him calmly, without a flicker of fear. In that moment, the last traces of the rain vanished. Only Brett remained and the filthy game he'd set in motion for this morning. Dawn. The special holding area sat isolated behind the courthouse, surrounded by rusted iron fencing and coils of barbed wire draped like the sinewy arms of a wild beast bound tight. Early morning mist mixed with the stale dampness that had built up overnight, rising from the concrete floor streaked with patches of green moss, thickening the breath of the guard on duty with a moldy, unnamed unease. Room 2, reserved for the special guest, was smaller than an ordinary cell. The cement walls were cracked with fine fissures, patches of dull gray paint peeling to reveal old brick underneath. A long wooden table, its surface carved up by countless knife marks, sat between two hastily assembled iron chairs. A flickering tube light hung low from the ceiling, blinking like the eyelid of a drowsy drunk. Outside the door, a young guard named Miller stood silent, hands wrapped around a coffee bought hastily from a street corner. The steam did nothing to warm his trembling fingers. Every so often, he glanced through the glass window at the middle-aged black woman inside, sitting still, calm as a living statue. She wore a dark coat, a long skirt brushing her ankles, buttoned up to the neck, no jewelry, not a hint of perfume. Her shoulder-length black hair, streaked with a few strands of silver, framed a face that spoke of experience without a trace of frailty. Her posture was upright, hands resting neatly on her lap, fingers interlaced, nails trimmed clean. An anonymous woman in a cramped holding room, yet her composure made the space feel far too small to contain that eerie calm. But what unsettled Miller the most wasn't her stiff posture or modest clothing, it was her eyes. Deep, pitch-black eyes that accepted every stare thrown at her yet seemed indifferent to keeping any secrets back. They were like mirrors, exposing whatever lurked beneath the police uniform Miller wore. Each time their eyes met, his throat dried out. His fingers squeezed the paper cup until it crumpled in his grip. He thought about pulling out his phone, typing a few words to the security team to request fresh orders. After all, she was just a woman, no criminal record, no suspicious documents, not a hint of panic. But then Brett Kellen's name flashed through his mind and Miller froze. A few words hovered on his screen, waiting to be sent. Then he deleted them. Who dare defy Brett? Who dare carry the fallout if Brett lost his temper? A long metallic scrape echoed down the hallway, like a blade dragging across cold steel. Miller snapped to attention, coffee splashing a drop onto his wrist. Brett Kellen appeared, stepping through the shadow of the heavy steel door, boots clacking sharply on the old cement floor. His police jacket was buttoned tight, the collar turned up, hiding most of the worn silver badge near his shoulder. Pale yellow light caught his face, a face carved to project authority, yet up close, the restrained arrogance sat deep in the crow's feet at the corner of his eyes. Brett loomed in the doorway, hands buried in his coat pockets, tilting his head just slightly to eye Miller's awkward stance. A cold, mocking smile flickered across his lips, saying plainly, "You're just here to hold the door. I handle the real work." Miller dropped his gaze, feet rooted to the floor, swallowing hard but unable to clear the rawness in his throat. Without a word of command, he slipped past Brett's shoulder, retreating quietly like a rat that smelled a hungry cat. His footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving behind a heavy silence. The steel door shut. Only Brett and the woman now faced each other across the battered wooden table. Brett didn't sit immediately. He stood, eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, a blatant inspection. Slowly, he pulled one hand from his pocket, tapping a fingernail on the dusty tabletop. She remained unmoving. Only her eyelashes fluttered once before those deep eyes fixed on Brett, piercing through his fair skin, through the polished armor of power, straight to the cowardice he'd hidden for so many years. Brett swallowed dryly, then forced his trademark smirk back onto his lips, masking the faint flicker of panic that felt like a paper cut. Outside, the early mist clung in streaks against the frosted window. Inside, the one-sided conversation began. No polite greetings, no need for lawyers. From the start, this was never meant to be fair. Yet, strangely, at this moment, the one truly in control didn't seem to be Brett Kellen. He stood frozen a moment longer after the guard's footsteps died away. The only sounds left were the drip of a leaking pipe in the corner and the steady breathing of the woman across from him. He tilted his head, wet his lips, eyes drifting from her narrow but upright shoulders to her hands resting perfectly still, then back to her face. No tension, just those bottomless black eyes unblinking, unflinching, fearless. He cleared his throat, then kicked the metal leg of the nearby chair lightly. The sharp squeal echoed off the narrow room's walls like an invisible chain being dragged. Brett lowered his voice, forcing each word out like iron wrapped in velvet. "Name, address, papers, you know the law." She didn't shift an inch. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes locked on his, as if peeling back a rotting layer of corruption beneath his polished badge. Her eyelid twitched faintly, but her hand never left her lap. Her index finger brushed a blue vein, a small, human gesture that somehow made Brett's chest tighten with irritation. He snapped a folded file from his pocket, a bundle of forged documents, sloppy stamps, fake names, a few bold lines scrawled with one purpose: to crack her calm. He read aloud, dragging each word like a hammer on the table. Dorothy Thomas Ellis, 62 years old, resident of East Harlem, previously suspected of aiding a group protesting the city police department. Got anything to deny? He slammed the file shut, tossed the papers onto the dusty table, and jerked his chin, waiting for her to crack. But instead of trembling or breaking into tears, she merely blinked slowly. Her lips pressed together, her face so unmoved it made him feel like a child pretending to be scary on a schoolyard stage. Then she tilted her head, her hair brushed her dark coat shoulder, and her eyes narrowed slightly as if to scan every hair on his head one more time. Her voice broke the silence, low, raspy, just loud enough for Brett alone to hear. "You're trembling, officer." One sentence, a needle puncturing the armor of arrogance Brett had worn for a decade. He felt his heart skip a beat, then pound like a broken clock. The vein in his neck twitched, his hand slipped from his pocket, clenching the handle of the hair clipper. Cold metal bit into his finger bones, chilling yet not enough to smother the heat rising behind his eyes. He leaned in, their faces only a few inches apart. Her breath smelled faintly of old tea, no fear, no sour sweat like all the others he'd ever interrogated. That infuriating calm stoked Brett's rage like gasoline on embers. He shot a quick glance at the door, spotting the guard's shadow peeking in, hand gripping the steel frame as if ready to intervene. Brett snapped his fingers sharply, eyes locking on the guard. One curt nod. The steel bolt clanked into place, sealing the room behind concrete walls that had heard hundreds of muffled cries no one ever witnessed. He inhaled, lips curling into a wolf's grin, the grin of a predator used to tearing the throat of anything weaker. His voice came out gravelly, each word ground out through clenched teeth. You think I'm afraid of you? Think those ink-smudged papers will save you? I'll make you see for yourself you have nothing left to hide. He tapped the hair clipper against the table edge. Its metal gleamed like a dull razor blade. She didn't flinch, only widened her eyes a fraction, pupils still calm like a lake about to ripple into a storm. For a fleeting instant, Brett thought he saw his own reflection in her eyes warped, blurred, the shape of a snake coiled to choke itself. All hallway noise vanished. Only the soft click of the clipper blades as he flicked it on broke the silence. A cold draft slipped through a wall crack, up the back of Brett's collar, sending a shiver through him as he bent closer, his breath stale with cigarette smoke mingling with the anger steaming from his nose. The steel door stayed locked. Outside, dawn had yet to break. Inside, an interrogation without a lawyer began exactly how only Brett intended, and she stared back without blinking. The thin thread of power stretched taut, ready to snap at any moment. The air inside the holding room grew heavier by the second as the sickly yellow tube light cast harsh shadows across Brett's cheeks, highlighting the swollen bags under his eyes, proof of a sleepless night spent plotting. He drew a deep breath, lips curling as he gestured for her to stand up. She didn't move, her eyes like an old mirror, reflecting the aggression swelling in his chest with every tick of silence. That silence was something Brett couldn't stand. He stepped behind her, bent low, his rough hand clamping down on her shoulder, squeezing hard, a brutal reminder that his authority had never been tested like this. Stand up. His voice dropped an octave but grated through clenched teeth. The woman tilted her head slightly, eyelids lowering for a moment before she rose calmly. No struggle, no sign of defiance. The slowness of it only aggravated Brett further. He needed fear. He needed pleading. But all she gave him was an unsettling calm, the one thing he couldn't control. He snatched the old leather handbag from her hand. The frayed strap scraped against her sinewy wrist, but she didn't cry out, only flexed her fingers once and let go. Brett tossed the bag onto the table, yanked the zipper open, and dumped its contents upside down. The dry rustle of papers scattering made the young guard outside the door draw a sharp, anxious breath. On the table, a worn leather notebook with frayed corners, a faded blue ink fountain pen, a paper-wrapped tea bag with a torn edge, a few receipts for snacks. That was it. Brett rummaged through everything, flipped the notebook pages as if searching for a bag of drugs hidden in the spine. All he found were scribbled notes of dates and short excerpts about human rights laws. But Brett had prepared for this. He seized a ragged scrap of paper, pretending to have unearthed damning evidence. What's this? Whose phone number is this? Contact for the protesters, huh? You're good. Real good. He waved the tiny piece of paper in the air like a flag of victory, voice strained with the thrill he fed himself. The woman said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the scrap Brett flaunted, her eyelids still, lips sealed tight, face unchanged. An ordinary person would have stammered an excuse or denied everything, but not her. That silence made the back of Brett's neck burn. The iron door squeaked. A uniformed head poked through the crack, the same young guard, still clutching his now cold coffee. He sensed the charged atmosphere, stepped 1 foot in, voice timid. "Officer Brett, what's going on here, sir?" Brett spun around, eyes bloodshot. He barked, not loudly, but forceful enough to make the guard flinch back. "Get in here. You stand witness. She's harboring illegal contact info. I'm executing a special security procedure." The guard shrank, catching the woman's gaze for a fleeting instant before looking down at his feet, knuckles whitening around his cup. No one asked any more questions, because in this room, the law had been bent the moment Brett stepped inside. In Brett's mind, It was all lined up. A clip of the suspect being dragged out and searched would leak, and the scene of her head being shaved would spread faster than news of a newly appointed judge. As her hair fell onto the grimy cement floor, her dignity would crumble in the public eye. A bald black woman, a suspect with shady contacts who would ever trust her with a gavel again. The thought sent a tremor of excitement through him, but buried inside that tremor was something else. Fear? Brett refused to name it. A vague, gut-deep dread. Why wasn't she resisting? Why wasn't she explaining herself? Why wasn't she screaming like all the others had under his hands? She wasn't cooperating, but her calm made Brett feel like a clown performing for eyes that had seen too many filthy acts to be fooled anymore. He gritted his teeth, muttered under his breath, nearly biting his tongue. Why won't you beg like the rest? Think silence will beat me. The flickering light overhead smeared shadows across the woman who, in just seconds, would lose her hair, the symbol of pride the law had mistakenly let her keep. Brett shot a glance at the guard, standing rigid by the door, a sharp look that said it all. The scene was set. He would play the butcher. She would be the living proof of what happens to anyone daring to sit higher than him in this city. Brett straightened his back in the cramped room, clasped his hands behind him like a circus master about to command his monkey act before an audience. He snapped his fingers, the sharp click bounced off the cold cement walls. He barked at the quivering guard, "Bring me the clipper." His voice wasn't loud but low and sharp, tongue pressing against his teeth to keep it from shaking. The young guard paled. The dull tube light reflected the red veins in his eyes. He bit his lip, stammered, "Officer Brett, should we inform command? I think maybe." Brett's boots scraped lightly on the floor one step closer, enough for the reek of stale smoke and sweat to hit the guard's face. "Listen close. You follow orders. I take the heat. Either do it or write your resignation tomorrow. Got it?" That threat crushed the guard's shoulders flat. He lowered his head, shuffled over to the supply locker, and pulled out a cloudy plastic box. Inside, the metal teeth of the clipper rattled faintly enough to make Brett's spine prickle, but also enough to let him savor the imagined sound of scalp being stripped bare under his hand. The guard handed over the box, his hands shaking so badly the lid popped off and clattered onto the floor with a dull clack, shredding any illusion this might just be intimidation. Brett snatched the clipper like a hunter grabbing a knife. This tool, today, was his weapon to carve away the proud mask of the woman standing so exposed before him. He flipped the switch. The blades hummed and clicked, the vibration crawling up his wrist bones. His hand trembled slightly. He clenched his jaw, steadied his breath, glared at the guard now plastered to the wall, like a puppy locked in a cage. "Out! Guard the door. No one comes in." Inside, only two people remained. The clipper's hum blended with Brett's ragged breathing and the faint drip of leftover rain tapping on the rusty tin roof outside. The woman still sat on the old wooden chair, back unsupported, her slender shoulders casting a shadow on the stained floor. She didn't bother looking at the buzzing metal near her nape. She looked at Brett straight into his eyes, as if seeing every filthy impulse squirming behind the polished badge on his chest. That stare stabbed Brett like a fine needle. A bead of sweat slid from his temple down his jawline. He hissed, "Look up. I want to see your face. I want to watch you when your dignity hits the floor." She didn't protest. She merely lifted her chin, her thin neck stretching slightly, veins standing out beneath speckled brown skin. Her eyes stayed wide open, black and deep as a dry well, bottomless enough for Brett to drown his hunger for power in. The clipper touched down for the first time. A soft rasp, a strand of black hair, streaked with gray, slid down onto her dark coat. A second, a third falling slow as gentle rain tapping leaves in early autumn. Brett hunched forward, his arm tensed like a butcher peeling the skin off a lamb whose breath had just left it. The machine's hum merged with his strained breath. He noticed hers remained steady, not ragged, not gasping. Outside the door, the young guard heard every sickening sound, sweat pouring down his face. His hand gripped the butt of his holstered gun, wondering, am I guarding justice or guarding a crime? Brett leaned in, knee pressing into the chair, words hissing through gritted teeth. "Good. Sit still just like that. Let's see who still trusts your gavel when they see this." those civil rights under my boots now. Each swipe of the blades tore away a chunk of hair from her scalp. Her narrow shoulders caught the falling strands like catching the ashes of a murdered authority. The more he shaved, the redder Brett's face grew intoxicated by the rush. Yet somewhere beneath it, a whisper hissed in his ear, "You're cutting the leash, holding you back from the abyss." She never screamed, never shed a tear. Her eyelids dipped halfway, like someone lulling themselves through a flaying storm. Her hands stayed resting lightly on her bony lap, fingers still. Only Brett, the one holding the clipper, was trembling. When the last lock slipped onto the cold tiles, he exhaled raggedly as if he'd just wrestled a beast made of shadows. He snapped the clipper off. The buzzing died, leaving only the smell of metallic sweat and shattered power in the stale air. He tossed the clipper onto the table, staring at the bald woman who still sat upright, back straight, neck unbowed. In that moment, Brett had no clue. Every strand he'd scattered on the floor today would one day bind him to the verdict that would rot the old wolf alive. The first touch of the clipper against the woman's silver-streaked hair felt like a blade ripping open the false veil of order Brett had always prided himself on maintaining. He bent close, breath reeking of stale cigarettes, mixing with the hot metallic scent radiating from the steel blades. His right hand clamped the handle so tight veins bulged along his knuckles, as if letting go for even a second would cause his hollow power to spill away with the falling strands. The first cut slid softly through the graying hair, buzzing and whining as the blade scraped skin. One strand dropped onto her shoulder, lying still like a dark ink blot on her frayed suit collar. Then another, drifting to the cold floor, curling into black streaks on rain-stained cement. Each strand made Brett's chest swell, tightening around the vile thrill he'd kept buried for so long. At first, this thrill made him feel like a badge-wearing Grim Reaper, able to judge and sentence anyone daring to stand taller than him. Since his rookie days, Brett's favorite moment had always been when a suspect's face hit the pavement and their eyes begged for mercy. For him, power didn't come from verdicts or gavels, it lived in the squeeze of a hand at another's throat. And today, right here, he believed he'd reclaimed that feeling pure, brutal, unsullied by paperwork. But the more he cut, the more that thrill turned sticky and rotten. He leaned, guiding the buzzing clipper from her forehead to her nape, left hand pressing lightly atop her head to keep the hair clear. But her eyes, half-lidded, half-open like a foggy mirror, showed not a flicker of fear. Every time Brett met that gaze, he saw a stone wall behind those calm lids, unbroken, unshaken, watching his filthy show without even bothering to plead for mercy. His breathing grew ragged. Sweat gathered on his brow, slid down the bridge of his nose, and soaked the uniform stretched tight from strain. He bent lower, hissed through clenched teeth, "Bow your head, cry. Let me see you like the street beggars you truly are." But all that answered him was the clipper's hum and the hush of hair falling like melting snow. The room felt like a narrow bunker now, filled with human heat and the musty tang of metal and sweat. The young guard, pressed flat against the wall near the door, had stopped watching. His eyes glued to the floor, one hand on his holstered gun, but his heart rattled not from fear of the woman fighting back, but because he was witnessing power stripped naked. No bullets, no blood, yet reeking of burnt flesh under cold steel teeth. Meanwhile, the woman kept her back straight, shoulders dipping slightly with each pass of the blade like an old branch bending to the storm but refusing to snap for its satisfaction. Behind her half-closed eyes, she drifted back to childhood days, her father lifting her onto his lap beside a wood stove, whispering stories of ancestors hanged for reading banned books. He had said, "Honor doesn't live in your hair, it runs in your blood. As long as you breathe, you carry it." Now, above the clipper's buzz biting her scalp, she heard him whisper again. She did not cry. The longer Brett clipped, the more violently he tugged, the clipper's whine merging with his heavy breath, a rusty funeral dirge for the last scraps of his human mask. Each lock that fell peeled back another patch of the rotten power, rotting inside him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't, because stopping would mean admitting he'd cracked open a door that could never close again. A bead of blood dotted the raw skin where the blade nicked her scalp, but she didn't flinch. Her lips pressed tight, trembling faintly as if she swallowed her final groan back down her throat. The The air thickened. The guard coughed dryly. The sound choked halfway. The last pass sealed this chapter of disgrace. Brett stepped back, staring at what he'd done. A patchy scalp, white skin gleaming under the weary yellow light. He tried to smile, but the grin cracked like old porcelain. In his eyes, his power was now a mirage, and she, stripped of her hair, still sat as still as a wooden effigy bracing for the final storm. The clipper still buzzed in Brett's hand like a caged metal beast. Each squeeze of his fingers made the blades snarl and spit over her sweaty scalp. The faint smell of burnt hair curled into the cell's damp mustiness. Outside, all sound seemed dead. Only the motor's hum and Brett's dry muttering filled the air. "Keep still. You think you can beat me with this?" His scarred, bruising fists, once used to batter black kids and crush street punks, now pinned her skull down. Her scalp, blotched red and seeping tiny beads of blood, gleamed under the flickering tube light. Each swipe hacked off another scrap of black and gray, drifting to the floor and spinning like discarded trash in the weak vent draft. At first, Brett relished it, feeling like a predator circling prey too broken to run. But slowly, that savage high flayed itself away, replaced by a cold spike crawling up his spine. He drove the clipper harder, trying to shred the suffocating silence blanketing him. She remained upright, neck tilted just so, eyes closed halfway. Not a whimper, not a plea, just the relentless snarl of the clipper and Brett's hot breath ghosting across her bare nape. A draft slipped under the door, dragging in leftover rain dampness from the corroded roof outside. The guard in the corner shivered. His eyes darted from Brett to the woman's scalped crown. He saw every patch of shaved hair, each shallow cut weeping red. Sweat dripped from his chin, soaking his collar in a dark smear. In his mind, a voice thudded like a heartbeat. Brett's lost it. I'm witnessing something that can't be undone. But no one spoke. In this room right now, reason had no place. The deeper Brett cut, the more his chest seethed. He ground his molars nearly to dust. Why won't you cry? Why? Who do you think you are, staring at me like that? The question pounded inside his skull like a hammer striking bone. The clipper dragged along her ear, shaving so close the skin wept red under each pass. Still, she was silent. Her silence no longer seemed weak. It was a spear rammed straight through the heart of the self-made executioner. Brett caught the guard inching closer to the door, eyes averted. He knew one camera here, and tonight would bury him alive. But he kept going. He would not stop because stopping meant she had won. It meant her silence was stronger than his machine's roar. He roared silently inside, forcing the clipper on. The few stray strands left flew like dry straw. In moments, there would be nothing left to cut. Then the clipper sputtered, buzzed, then jammed. Brett jerked, thumb slamming the switch. Silence poured into the room like cold water. All the noises the clipper had devoured roared back at once. The drip of sweat from the guard's cheek, Brett's hoarse panting, and one long, slow exhale from the lips of the newly shaven woman. She sat there still scalp bare, dotted red, shoulders unbowed. Her thin back seemed braced by an iron rod. She exhaled, lips parting a hair's breadth before closing again, not letting a single word escape. In that silence, Brett realized he was trembling because only he could hear the crack of his own collapse. He stepped back, staring at the heap of hair he'd scattered the trap he'd set, and blindly stepped into himself. The guard stood frozen, fists clenched in his shirt hem to keep them from shaking. In the corner, the woman's bare crown shone under the dead yellow light upright, calm, like a stone statue battered by storms yet untoppled. And Brett, the man who moments ago fed on humiliation, could not know that the hair littering the floor was the noose tightening around his proud NYPD badge. Her silence at last had spoken, and its echo would carry farther than any roar he had ever howled in his life. The intercom crackled to life, its static screech stabbing into the eardrums of everyone huddled in the holding room. "Presiding judge, please proceed to the courtroom," a routine announcement. Yet this time, it ripped apart the heavy air reeking of humiliation that Brett Kellen had just orchestrated minutes ago. He stood next to the bench where the shaven-headed woman sat slightly bowed, her old suit jacket stained with a few flecks of dried blood mixed with stray hair. Brett sneered, snapped at the cluster of young officers murmuring nearby. "You hear that? I'm about to drag this trash out to the courtroom myself. Want pictures? Take 'em. Let her finish her show before I dump her back in lockup." One bold kid raised his phone for a quick shot. The flash flickered, then vanished when the intercom shrieked a second time, sharper. "Presiding judge, please proceed to the courtroom." A split second felt like someone clenched a fist around every throat in the room. The young officers turned to Brett, then to the woman who slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze, once shadowed, now shattered the darkness deep, black, but clear as a midnight lake untouched by wind. Brett's eyes darted. He barely managed to lace his fingers behind his back to fake his model officer stance before catching the strange glints flickering among the others. Some stepped back half a pace, brushing shoulders, mouths opening but no words coming out. The air, thick with sweat and disinfectant, suddenly reeked of hot metal. The woman sat still. Her hair was hacked patchy by Brett, red blotches on her scalp stabbed at his fragile ego. She lifted a hand, slowly, tidily adjusting her lapel, each thin finger deliberate, as if sharpening an old blade. A small smear of blood by her temple was wiped away with one swipe, no fuss, no second touch. Her eyes opened fully, not a flicker of fear, only a look sharp as bare steel under a white lamp. Brett swallowed hard, throat scraped dry, his hand by reflex groping for the baton he usually strapped to his belt, but there was nothing left to salvage the image of the keeper of order. He forced a grin, his voice gritty as sandpaper dragged through lungs. "You hear that? I'll personally escort you out of here. Right up to the courtroom door like a perfect model defendant." But the farce Brett had built now convinced only himself. A few officers who'd slapped his back in a bar last week now edged further away, dodging his eyes locked instead on the woman standing upright, shoulders square again, as if she alone were the spine now holding the whole room together. The intercom screeched a third time, brief but hammering the base of Brett's skull. He spun to the nearest rookie. "What are you standing there for? Drag her out." But the rookie only stammered, "Officer Brett, I can't." She didn't wait for an order. She stepped forward from the bench, legs trembling from stiffness but steadying quickly. She smoothed the wrinkles from her battered sleeve, lifted her chin, and stared directly at Brett, not with hate or rage, but with a look that stripped away his sweaty mask and laid bare what he truly was. A coward, wearing a wolf's skin. Her shoe heels struck the tiles with dry snaps, each step echoing in Brett's ears like a verdict without a gavel. He opened his mouth to bark a command but choked when she spoke first. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't high, just firm, clear, harder than iron. "Take me to the courtroom, to my rightful seat." Uniforms wavered like grass under a harsh gust. A grizzled officer, hair gone silver at the temples, clutched the butt of his gun, voice quivering like a boy caught stealing. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Brett backed away, spine pressing into the graffiti-stained brick wall. His lips flapped soundlessly, eyes darting for an ally but found only heads bowed. Eyes turned away from him and toward her, the woman who had risen from a pile of severed hair and the cowardice of men in uniform, reclaiming the throne of justice not with a shout, but with silence sharp as a drawn sword. 3 minutes. That was all she needed to transform shame into triumph, and to turn the hunter back into a trembling prey pinned under her fingertips. The hallway from the holding area to the main courtroom wasn't long, but each step tonight stretched like the miles she'd endured to guard the true meaning of justice. Old neon lights flickered in broken segments, spotlighting her shaven, blood-specked scalp, her faded navy suit creased beyond dignity. Yet no one, not even the gaggle of reporters tailing her, dared drop their cameras when her gaze swept by. A hallway guard half raised his hand to block her path but only managed a choked, "Your Honor," before snapping his arm back and bowing his head. Her figure brushed past him, light as a cold gust, yet heavy enough to pin his boots to the floor. Behind her, Brett trailed like a warped shadow stuck to her back. He hunched, gripping a colleague's shoulder. "What are you staring at? She's not a judge. Her credentials are gone. She's under discipline. You have to stop her." "Oh." The colleague jerked his elbow, shaking off Brett's desperate clutch like a drowning man losing grip on a rotting branch. He shook his head, voice raspy with dread. "Brett, you're finished. I won't stand in her way. I want to keep my badge." Her low heels struck the tile crisp and clean. Reporters swarmed behind her like a halo of cameras, flashbulbs crackling alive and brightening the tight hallway. A young reporter snapped frantically, whispering into her mic, "You are witnessing an unprecedented moment." The judge, humiliated by police in her own holding room, now walks out to preside over the very trial of that crime. Instantly, live news feeds erupted like a breached dam. A television correspondent shouted into his mic, "We can now confirm Judge Dorothy Ellis is the woman officer Brett Kellen publicly humiliated by forcibly shaving her head. She is proceeding to lead today's hearing in person." Phone screens all along the hall flashed breaking news alert. Within 3 minutes, the hashtag Judge Strikes Back shot to the top of the trending board, overtaking sports scores and celebrity scandals alike. Social media swarmed like a hornet nest. Millions shocked, furious, yet unable to look away from the image of a bald head lifted proudly amid those who once believed they could bend justice at will. Brett stumbled, dragging his feet as if stuck in wet cement. The spine he used to puff out so proudly before his peers now curled like someone had snapped it in half. He tried to roar, but pain lanced his temple, and what came out was a strangled gasp. "She can't. She doesn't have her credentials. She's not allowed. She can't sit that bench again." But before him, dozens of uniformed eyes no longer fixed on him as their leader. They looked away, silently parting into 2 lines. The wall of power Brett had built over 15 years crumbled faster than a brick wall struck at its foundation. She stopped before the courtroom's wooden door, hand gripping her frayed lapel, shoulders still squared. For a heartbeat, the hallway held its breath. A thin hand, nails chipped from being bound too long, slowly lifted. The hinges creaked. The door swung open. From the gap spilled cool air, the sterile scent of paper and ink, the untouched scent of justice. Inside, dozens of clerks, lawyers, and journalists turned at once. Whispered chatter choked off like a throat being crushed. She stepped inside, shoes tapping the polished stone floor. Her bald head was no longer a scar of shame, it was a living testament. "I do not bow." Dorothy Ellis stood tall behind the judge's bench, fingers flipping open the docket, her voice ringing out like a bronze bell. Court is now in session. Outside the door, Brett stood frozen. His arms hung limp, eyes locked on the back of the woman he once spat on as garbage. The officers parted around him like mourners at a funeral, leaving the beast they once feared rooted in the one place he thought was his kingdom. And there, amid cold stone, white light, and the stroke of a signature pen, the man once untouchable witnessed himself called out by naked, living justice, and not a single roar of his could drown it out. Brett Kellen pushed open the heavy wooden door of District Courtroom 4 with just enough force to make the hinges creak loud enough to draw every eye in the room. He strode in like a victor, one hand gripping the shoulder of the black woman whose hair he had just hacked to ragged stubble, her scalp blotched white under the cold overhead lights. On her shoulder, the frayed seams of her old suit were smoothed flat as if the fabric itself refused the role of victim. The wooden benches along both aisles tilted slightly as officers, court clerks, and a few reporters near the hallway snapped their heads around. Whispers bloomed. Eyes locked onto the bizarre sight. A woman, not in handcuffs, not forced to bow, walking with her back straight, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. The scene was so absurd that a few reporters instinctively lifted their cameras then lowered them again, afraid they were shooting some rehearsal outtake. Brett flicked his eyes at a colleague seated on the left, nodding as if to say, "Look at this, I just showed this whole city who makes the law." He cracked a smirk, the smirk of a man convinced his vile spectacle would spread like a spark torching the throne she dared dream to sit on. In his mind, he pictured her pale, pleading, choking out sobs, tears clouding the pristine tile floor reserved for neat testimonies and red-stamped verdicts. But the moment he let go of her shoulder, pressing her to bend slightly before the bench, every scenario in Brett's head crumbled to dust. Because she, the woman he'd silently degraded with every word in his mind, did not bow. She did not beg. She shrugged off his touch like flicking away a speck of lint, then turned her back on him, baring the patchy scalp with short hairs clinging stubbornly in places. The courtroom fell dead silent. The court clerk's fountain pen slipped and hit the desk with a dry clack. A reporter, mid-note, froze, pen hovering in the air. She stepped forward, each step firm, her heels hammering the tiles like a judge's gavel pounding into the predator's skull. Dorothy Ellis, the name whispered across police stations for days, muttered over coffee in backstreet law firms, the name Brett had skimmed on a torn file just last night now stood tall before the bench. She extended her hand. A green-faced rookie clerk trembled, placing the heavy gavel handle into her thin but unyielding palm. Brett swallowed, throat raw, as if filled with grit. He stepped back half a pace, then forced himself to freeze to keep up the pose of control. But the vein in his temple throbbed, burning away the last scrap of confidence, leaking under the tarnished silver badge on his chest. Dorothy did not look at him. She raised the gavel, struck it 3 times. The sound cracked through the chamber like stones dropped into a deep well. The room bent back into true shape, real order snapping tight again, unraveled only minutes before by a cop who fancied himself the law. ***, District Court Number 4 is now in session. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang through every heart like a bronze bell tolling in a village long asleep. A collective breath slipped from 100 lungs. Brett could hear the hissing murmurs. It's her, Dorothy Ellis, the new judge. She was shaved right before court. God. A blonde reporter, mid-scrolling through a crime update, bolted upright, babbling into his phone outside the hall. Jack, get the camera rolling now. It's her, the new judge. Brett shaved her head. Roll it, now. Brett heard none of it. What he heard clearest was his own heartbeat, drumming like war drums in his ribcage. His hand drifted to his holster, thumb flicking the safety out of sheer animal reflex, a fool's shield against the abyss yawning open. He felt the NYPD badge on his chest weigh like a boulder, snapping every spine of arrogance he'd fattened for years as the darkness's pet hound. And in front of him, that raw scalp was no longer a mark of shame. It was a crown of iron thorns she had forged herself, slammed right onto the floor he once claimed as his den. For a heartbeat, Brett understood. Every mask he'd plastered onto his snarl had peeled off, shred by shred, with each crisp gavel strike. This courtroom no longer had room for a wolf in a police cap. The third gavel strike hadn't yet died in the charged air when Dorothy raised her head, black eyes gleaming with an ember that had never gone out. She paused a heartbeat to steady her breath, then spoke in a voice calm as a steel scale. Officer Brett Kellen hereby suspended from duty effective immediately, pending investigation for abuse of power and defamation of the district court. Her words fell clean and unshaken, a blade slicing the cheap hide of authority Brett had draped over himself for years. She didn't need to yell, she just spoke enough for every cold wall to hear, enough to silence every rumor-mongering mouth. A second of stunned silence exploded into a wave of whispers. Lens caps snapped open, cameras clicked, an old mic squealed alive as it was yanked up. A reporter in the front row gasped into his phone, voice cracking with adrenaline. Stream it. Right now. Black judge, head shaved by NYPD, now investigating the force herself. Holy hell, this is solid gold. In a corner, a trembling media aide fumbled to push the live feed. The phone screen caught Dorothy's face, scalp raw and patchy, yet her eyes unscarred. She stared straight through the lens, needing no words but the next iron sentence. Within 30 days, I will re-examine every case bearing Brett Kellen's signature. Every verdict will be relit under daylight. No innocent blood shall dry beneath false paperwork. A short sentence, yet it hammered a hole through the painted wall of internal responsibility built up for decades. The NYPD, so proud of its hallways lined with medals, stood stripped bare by one bald woman facing a swarm of cameras alone. Brett's mask cracked, his lips trembled, hand hovering near his sidearm but not daring to clutch it. Sweat trickled from his temple into his collar, soaking into the damp uniform he'd once used to terrify the powerless. He stepped back, eyes glued to the wooden floor that once shook under his barked orders. 2 court security officers in navy suits stepped up, iron pillars in human shape. One clamped Brett's shoulder, the other twisted his arms behind him, moves they drilled 100 times but never used on a fellow badge bearer. The cuffs clicked cold and final around his wrists, drawing a sharp line between the untouchable predator he'd been and the exposed carcass he was now. His eyes darted at Dorothy, quivering, begging silently, no words left to hide behind. She looked at him for 2 seconds. No smile, no contempt, just a chilling stillness. Justice, she said without speaking, has no skin color, no badge, and fears no medal pinned on a false guardian's chest. A reporter near the window murmured to himself, God, she's bald, but it looks like she's wearing a crown. She's the law, not those tin badges. He didn't know hundreds of thousands watching the live feed thought the exact same thing. The gavel lifted once more, no need for 3 strikes now. jaw. One sharp crack, hard as a nail, hammered into the forehead of the fallen beast. The hearing proceeds. Investigative procedures for Brett Kellen will take place in closed session. I, Dorothy Ellis, vow all truths shall stand in the light. The gavel's final blow killed the power dream of a hunting dog that had torn too many innocent throats. That same blow unlocked a new path where that scarred scalp was no longer a mark of disgrace but an iron crown. Dorothy Ellis had forged herself from the blades of humiliation moments ago. As two officers dragged Brett toward the door, the hum of murmurs swelled into waves. Cameras followed, filming the once feared enforcer now stumbling like a death row convict denied a final plea. At the high bench, Dorothy stood tall, shoulders squared, the gavel resting with quiet force beside her open docket. Here, justice did not bow. Here, justice wore no police cap. Justice stood shoulder to shoulder with the people, forged from every drop of blood, every strand of hair, every shred of dignity sacrificed to keep it alive. Brett Kellen had never imagined he would one day stand exactly at this defendant's dock, but not to snarl threats at trembling prey. Now it was him, the man who'd shoved so many sheep to their knees right here, being dragged out like a mangy fox, claws blunted, unable to scratch anyone. On both sides, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras aimed directly at his fear-bleached face. There was no one left for him to bark orders at. Get out of my courtroom. No more internal affairs, buddy whispering. Do it, I'll bury the file. The cold from the tiled floor seeped through the shiny shoes that once strutted through back alleys at midnight. Brett's eyes darted, scanning the witness benches, the back rows praying for a familiar blue uniform to stand up, to nod like always. Relax, I'll clean this up for you again. But there was no one. Only dozens of eyes staring straight at him, some gloating, some bitter, all unblinking. Every insult he'd spit at the poor, every slap, every time he forced a kid's face into mud, now coiled back around his neck, tearing through the false pride he once wore as armor. Up on the bench, Dorothy Ellis sat upright. Her patchy shaved scalp was clear under the beam of daylight from the high windows. One hand rested on a thick file, bony fingers tapping steadily on the worn edge of the pages. Each tap was a nail hammered into Brett's chest, pinning him motionless. Her voice rang out, not loud, not harsh, free of any performative rage. Brett Kellen, New York PD officer, you stand here charged with forging an official order, abusing authority, assaulting and defaming the honor of this court of law. This is a preliminary summary of the investigation, to be made public to the press and the community. Brett heard each word through a buzzing in his skull. He had imagined she would screech, would spit his name like the black kids he'd once beaten until they screamed. But no, her calm voice drowned him deeper than any shouting could. Dorothy flipped page after page, a 16-year-old girl's complaint about being interrogated all night with no lawyer, an internal memo he himself had fed to the shredder, records of ordinary people silenced with back-alley threats. Cameras flashed endlessly. Outside, the crowd swelled. From the balcony, people hoisted signs. No more wolves in uniform. Justice for Dorothy. And the boldest, shaves her head, but not justice. On Twitter, Justice for Dorothy and shaves her head blazed across trending feeds. Local news stations streamed live, dragging national networks into the feed. Asterisk, asterisk. Brett's throat clenched. He wanted to roar, to bite, to tear the microphone from his lapel, just to feel like a wolf again. But his mouth dried up, jaw twisting sideways into a pathetic rasp. I was just executing orders. I had the right to run a security check. I didn't mean to humiliate. Dorothy didn't lift an eyebrow. She didn't cut him off with a shout. She merely looked up from the file, her eyes scanning him like a rotten piece of paperwork. Officer Brett Kellen, the law does not grant you the right to forge orders, nor to wield state power for personal humiliation. What you did this morning was not official duty, it was deliberate violence, and this violence will be judged openly. No shadow will hide it. A ripple rose through the crowd behind the glass, tentative applause, then swelling into a wave like a chorus. A reporter double-checked his mic. CNN's ticker flashed, breaking, NYPD officer. On trial, Judge Dorothy speaks. Brett stood rigid, shoulders slumped, sweat drenching the cuffs cold against his wrists. His knees wobbled, but two court officers on either side pinned him down like nails to the floor. Dorothy lowered the file, switched the gavel to her other hand. She tapped it once, the sound dry and final, like a prison door bolt sliding shut. The court will recess while the panel collects additional recordings and witness statements. The defendant remains in custody under this court's authority. And, Brett panted, eyes dropping like a caught child with a stolen candy, no wolfish snarl left in his hollow stare. The gavel stroke had stripped him from proud predator to cornered lamb, trembling under true justice's roar. The gavel's echo only held back the buzz for minutes. An hour later, when Dorothy nodded to reconvene, every empty seat brimmed with more reporters and fresh witnesses summoned by frantic court clerks. Brett Kellen still stood there, cuffed, lips bloodless. A court-appointed defense lawyer stepped from the right row, barely past 30, crisp white shirt creased, blue tie ringed with sweat at the collar. His stride faltered when he caught Brett's vacant stare. No one wanted to defend a beast who dug his own grave, but the law demanded he have a voice. Dorothy dipped her head slightly, commanding, "Counsel, you are here to ensure the defendant's basic rights, but be advised, this court will not tolerate any plea designed to bury the truth now documented." The young lawyer nodded, swallowing hard, then stepped back half a pace, surrendering the floor entirely to her control. The witness called, Carl Ferris, Brett's rookie shadow, always mute when Brett barked orders on the street. Carl rose, gripping a sweat-stained sheaf of photocopies. Spotlights swung onto his pale face, broadcasting every blink. Dorothy tapped once, her voice steeled. "Mr. Carl, recount in detail what you witnessed this morning, and all that you have held back until now." Carl's lips pressed tight, shoulders trembled, eyes flicking to Brett's glare, a rattlesnake ready to strike. But then Carl's gaze lifted to Dorothy's bald scalp, the raw line where 3 minutes of shame had turned to unbreakable iron. "Your Honor, this morning I was ordered to assist with a special witness check. I suspected the order wasn't proper. The signature was from Lieutenant McGarry, who retired months ago. I was threatened by Mr. Brett," he said. "If I talked, I wouldn't live to repeat it." A bone-deep hush crushed the room. Dorothy nodded calmly, signaling the clerk to play the recording. From the speaker mounted beside her bench, Brett's own voice rasped out, thick with liquor and arrogance. "Listen up, Carl. You just stand there and watch me teach that black bitch a lesson. She'll never dare dig into our business again. You squeal? I'll make you vanish like Craig did 3 months ago, got it?" Static fuzzed, then continued. "I'll shave her damn head myself. Scare her so bad she'll never stand straight again. Law? My ass." Brett's face drained of blood. His jaw twitched, mouth opening uselessly. He looked to the lawyer for a lifeline, but the man just stared at the floor, too ashamed to meet his eyes. Cameras fired relentlessly. The shutter clicks landed like 100 slaps each time Brett tried to snarl a rebuttal. Dorothy didn't need to shout. She tapped the gavel once, crisp, with corroborating audio and matching witness testimony. This court orders Brett Kellen held without bail to prevent witness intimidation or destruction of evidence. All defendant assets are frozen for investigation. Outside, the hum of the crowd burst into a roar. A reporter sprinted through the side door into the plaza. The mob that had gathered since dawn thundered with new signs. Justice has clawed back. Her gavel drops wolves bow down. Brett shook under the bailiff's iron grip. His eyes glistened, not with predatory flame but splintered fear. The wolf once feared by fresh prosecutors now shriveled into a shivering lamb, dreading the skinning knife of justice. Dorothy rose slowly, fingers brushing her collar smooth, spine straight as a blade. Her eyes swept the courtroom, pausing squarely on Brett's bowed head. No insults, no vengeful sneer. She let the gavel speak for her. Justice may be slow, but it never sleeps. This hearing adjourns. Remove Brett Kellen to holding. The final gavel crack split the air, sharp and final. On the highest bench, Dorothy's scarred scalp shone under the chandelier, a crown missing jewels, yet studded with raw courage. Below, Brett was hauled away. No wolf, no badge, just shallow breaths choked by the chant rolling through the crowd. Justice, justice, justice. The courtroom this morning was sealed tighter than any prior hearing. Court security officers, credentialed reporters, a handful of defense attorneys, internal affairs inspectors, and a team of Justice Department monitors filled every creaking wooden bench, eyes locked on the high dais where Dorothy Ellis appeared, her scalp still bare, rough patches and faint scars plainly visible under the overhead lights. Unlike yesterday's tension-crackling trial that watched Brett fall alone, today the room buzzed with a different hunger. People wanted to see whose hands had wiped Brett's blood off a uniform time and again. Dorothy knew it well. She wore no ceremonial black robe, just a dark gray suit, collar buttoned plain, a discreet mic clipped at her chest. Before her lay a thick stack of files, edges frayed, plastered with red sticky notes, scraps of evidence long buried at the bottom of dusty steel cabinets. She did not open with a speech. She simply cleared her throat, tapped the file's spine, and looked straight at the prosecution bench. Today, District Court Number 4 will publicly disclose everything related to Brett Kellen, not just his proven crimes, but the system that shielded him from justice for years. Oh, a few inspectors shifted, necks stiffening to hide their faces. A young prosecutor, only 2 years into a deputy seat, flicked a glance at his chief, then buried his head in his notes, hand trembling so badly his pen dropped. Behind them, reporters raised phones for live streams, headlines flashing instantly. Dirty Shield, NYPD, Wolf Den Purge, begins. Dorothy opened the first file, her voice steady, yet drilling straight into the eardrums of those below. In 2011, Brett Kellen was accused of tampering with witness statements in the shooting death of a young black man named Tyson Rourke. Original evidence matched witness accounts, but the day before the hearing, the original report vanished from the archive. The head of internal security at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Floyd Grant, the case closed as insufficient evidence to conclude misconduct. A hand twitched. An elderly man, hair silver, the insignia of his former rank now gone from his lapel, sat in the third row, dabbing sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief. He'd convinced himself Dorothy wouldn't dig this deep, but her eyes lingered on him just long enough for him to realize every exit he'd counted on had just shut itself. She flipped to the second file. In 2015, Brett Kellen was accused by Clarissa Holt of assault and forced confession for drug possession. The complaint vanished 3 hours before trial. An internal jury claimed, server malfunction data unrecoverable. I have recovered it from a personal backup. Clarissa Holt gave her private attorney. It is here. She held up the scanned page, its corner stained with a faded coffee ring, but Clarissa Holt's signature and bruised photo were intact. Camera shutters snapped. Laptop keys clattered. A new hashtag jumped up trending, Brett Cover Up. Skeptics now connected the dots. Brett hadn't scrubbed his tracks alone, he'd been cleaned by an entire power web. Dorothy paused, checked her sticky notes, and peeled off a yellowed red-cornered slip. She signaled the clerk to play audio. A muffled recording buzzed out Brett's voice, grainy from an old recorder, but clear enough to chill every spine. You handle the file. I'll get rid of that witness. I swear, when I'm done, those old jurors'll shut up too. Every eye swiveled to the elderly lieutenant colonel. He slumped back, bloodless. A federal lawyer leaned in to whisper to the Justice Department inspector beside him. They scribbled a note, immediately passing it to 2 waiting internal security officers. Outside the glass, the crowd hoisted fresh banners. Brett was just the mask. Rip it off. The chant echoing faintly through the sealed courtroom. Brett's just the surface. We want the whole pack dragged into the light. N. Dorothy tapped her pen on the files, voice final. Today's public hearing is only the beginning. I officially order a full reinvestigation of every NYPD internal connection tied to Brett Kellen. Anyone who obstructed, concealed, or colluded will be named and questioned publicly before this community. The buzz erupted like fire in dry grass. Reporters surged for the doors, live feeds aimed at the crowd outside. Dorothy didn't stand right away. She closed the files slowly, her eyes sweeping over each pale face below the stare of someone with no hair left but sharp enough spines to pierce every rusted mask. Years of lies had soldered on. The thick dossier, public for not even 48 hours, had already struck at the core of the people once propping up Brett Kellen like a dirty umbrella in the rain. Inside NYPD's closed wood-paneled offices, rushed calls and hushed meetings bloomed in panicked silence. The loudest mouths of yesterday now sat quiet, rehearsing excuses to keep chairs that trembled like rotten floorboards over an abyss. The first counterpunch from the underground network landed dirty and fast. Local outlets suddenly received anonymous packages. Rushed web bulletins popped up. Dorothy Ellis once fired from DA's office. Sources: she's borderline unstable. Once sought therapy. Brett's files faked for her personal revenge. The court's media clerks scrambled to issue corrections, but lies outran truth at keystroke speed. Meanwhile, Brett's court-appointed lawyer, the same man who'd sat beside him at the initial hearing, abruptly filed to withdraw, citing threats to my family's safety, a simple excuse, but behind it a clear warning. Anyone still shielding Brett risked disappearing without a trace, witness and all. But Dorothy was not a woman undone by old filth repackaged. The next morning, she stepped calmly onto the dais, dropping a stack of original file scans before the media backups she'd hidden on a private USB locked in a civil rights attorney friend's safe in another city. The scans were intact, complete with edits, revision dates, and undeniable signatures. A cannon blast tearing through the underworld's attempt to wipe its fingerprints clean. She didn't stop there. She signed an official request for the Federal Justice Department to deploy a special oversight team. No local figure had power enough to interfere with federal monitors sitting beside her desk every morning. Every document Brett ever touched was now sealed in the evidence room, labeled federal custody. Dorothy's counterstrike was swift, hard, and total, pushing Brett's entire protection racket back against a wall with no retreat left. That same afternoon, Brett, huddled in a temporary cell, was marched back into court to give additional testimony before federal prosecutors. He wore a gray prison jumpsuit, face hollow, stubble sprouting on his chin. His swollen eyes darted to the door where mid-ranking officers peered in, the same ones who used to clap his back and jeer, "Relax, Brett, you do the dirty work, we'll clean your mess." Now, no one offered a hand. His old pack hid behind glass panels, feigning phone calls, scribbling fake notes, avoiding the desperate eyes of the chained hunting dog. Brett trembled like brittle twigs when asked, "Who ordered the files wiped? Who told you to threaten witnesses? Who signed off the slush fund bonuses?" His cracked lips spat out broken sounds. He knew if he named names, he'd be silenced before he left that cell. But if he kept quiet, the coming sentence would slam shut on him like a nailed coffin. Outside, the crowd swelled bigger than ever, a swarm of red ants scenting blood. Major outlets snapped the fresh banner, "NYPD Scandal of the Century." Night marches flared with flashlights and posters sketching Dorothy's head with bold words, "Justice has no hair, but has teeth." High above, after 3 grinding hours of testimony, Dorothy leaned against the courthouse's glass window. She still wore her dark gray suit. Her hair hadn't yet begun to grow back, but her eyes were rock steady. Below, the square flickered with camera lights, megaphones, and the unified chant, "Brett's just the surface, pull the pack out." A heartbeat pounding against her ribs, a reminder that the seats of those men sipping whiskey over innocent blood were cracking bolt by bolt. She knew this dragnet wouldn't close overnight. It would dredge out old names, polished smiles, the men who once slapped Brett's back and laughed. Dorothy closed her eyes, drew a slow breath. Out there, justice was no longer a slogan carved above a courthouse door. It was the real footsteps of thousands demanding a debt paid in blood and truth. The dragnet was only beginning, and those power seats were sinking like a rotted wooden hull hauled into daylight after a long, filthy storm. That morning, the hallway of District Court Number 4, already damp with rain, grew heavier still with body heat and the scorched ink scent of cameras firing non-stop. Among the packed crowd, a freelance photojournalist in a frayed shoulder jacket and rain-soaked canvas shoes pressed himself against a stone pillar like a burglar casing a house. His hands clutched a telephoto lens, angling through the courtroom door crack just in time to catch Brett Kellen shoving Dorothy's head down, one hand pinning her hair while the other jammed a buzzing clipper blade into her salt and pepper hair, yet to be brushed neat. One click of the shutter, the snap was quieter than the reporter's own pounding heartbeat, and at that exact moment, history was quietly recorded by the flash of an old camera. He didn't linger. As the courtroom door slammed shut, he bolted down the fire escape, flipped open a battered laptop on the landing, stitched a quick 30-second clip, and launched it on TikTok and Reddit. 4 hours later, Twitter exploded like a breached dam. A shaky, grainy video but clear enough. Dorothy's jaw clenched, Brett smirking behind her, the clippers slicing cruelly through her aging hair. The first hashtag under the clip, shaves her head. Traditional media hesitated at first. Local networks feared poking NYPD, a PR machine well-trained in crushing bad press. But when retweets topped 200,000 in just 2 hours, every big news desk knew, stay silent now and sync with it. AP, CNN, Reuters, all pushed headlines like spears through New York's proud badge, racist cop humiliates, black judge in courtroom. Oh, across YouTube, reaction channels dissected Brett's smirk, Dorothy's frozen endurance, then paused on the frame of her rising to her feet, gripping the gavel, lips pressed tight, scalp patchy but her back unbowed. Within 8 hours, shaves her head surpassed 1 million posts. Major streamers spliced memes. First, Brett's clipper grazing hair. Next, Dorothy's gavel crashing onto NYPD files. Civil rights groups didn't miss a beat. From the Black Bar Association to the National Association of Women Judges to grassroots justice groups, all issued statements. The New York Times sent investigative reporters to dig up Brett's record, dredging old police brutality cases swept quietly under the rug. Celebrities with millions of followers joined in, rappers, actors, politicians. They reposted the clip with a single line. You can shave her head, but you can't shave justice. In just hours, Dorothy Ellis, a name unknown outside legal circles only 2 days prior, became a living legend. Every development plastered the top of U.S. trending tabs. Beneath thousands of reposts bloomed personal stories, someone recalling a father beaten unjustly by police in '99, another reliving an older brother tortured in an interrogation room. Each story amplified the festering wound in NYPD's public trust. Inside the 16th precinct, the air thickened with quiet dread. Veteran officers who'd once benefited from Brett's services whispered, "They're gonna dig up every dusty file now." A few secretly messaged congressional investigators, swearing to spill the entire protection racket to salvage their own badges. The Justice Department had no choice but to dispatch a spokesperson by late afternoon. The statement was 3 lines flat. We commit to a full investigation. An independent monitor will participate. All abuses of power will be prosecuted to the fullest extent. Dry words, but the public storm ensured they now hung like a noose over any hidden conspirators. Meanwhile, CNN looped its first special report. Brett hunched over in cuffs, side by side with Dorothy, bald but upright, hammering her gavel on the bench. A ticker crawled beneath. How the woman they shaved rose to strike back with the gavel of justice. And so, within a single night, Dorothy's shaven head ceased to be the mark of humiliation. It became the new standard-bearer for a rage decades deep in this city, a declaration of war waged not with gunfire, but by the cold swing of a courtroom gavel smashing rotten power to dust. Within 2 days of the leaked clip, the hashtag storm had leapt off social feeds straight into nightly opinion panels across America. Major outlets didn't just headline the courtroom humiliation, they stitched together long-form breakdowns starting with black and white shots. Dorothy, bald, gripping the gavel, intercut with footage of 60s civil rights leaders. A bold underline captioned every frame, a new icon for justice that never bows. Reporters retraced her steps, from every lock of hair shaved off under Brett's hand, to her unshaken stride toward the bench, shoulders squared, hand clenching the gavel, eyes daring anyone to ever look down on her again. Viewers behind TVs and phones drew deep breaths, then flooded the comment sections. Give her a federal judge seat. This isn't just a trial, it's an overthrow. Amid every flashbulb and microphone shoved in her face, Dorothy chose silence. She refused all interviews, declined exclusive offers from big networks, sat out talk shows, never typed a word online. Her only appearances were for live court sessions or when public summons were issued. That silence, stage-averse yet iron-spined, fueled the press to craft an even fiercer legend. The gavel queen who needed no crown. Online humor turned gospel. Memes flooded Reddit, Twitter, Instagram. A viral image showed Brett's clipper poised at her hair, cut mid-frame to her gavel slamming down on warped NYPD badges. Caption, "You can shave my hair, but you can't shave justice." For millions, it wasn't just a punchline. It became an unofficial creed. for a movement demanding a deep cleansing of a gangrenous force. When social fury roared loud enough, politics jolted awake. New York state legislators, usually slow to hold emergency hearings on police abuse for fear of powerful lobbies, scrambled to convene public inquiries. One faction pushed to freeze funding for any patrol divisions linked to internal scandals. News of it spread like wildfire, fueling a fresh hashtag, "Cut the Shield." Meanwhile, conservative and police ally groups scrambled too. Some rushed to disown Brett, desperate to salvage minority and swing voters. Others clung to the old script. One bad apple doesn't represent the NYPD. But the more they spun it, the more netizens unearthed old clips and case evidence proving Brett had been forgiven countless times before. The same backroom shield that once protected him now lay butchered on the chopping block of public scorn. On the streets, protests flared. At first, a few dozen gathered on the courthouse steps with candles and crude Dorothy placards. But as night fell, phone flashes lit up like a sea of stars. People chanted Dorothy's name without megaphones, passing hand-drawn posters of her bald head and gavel crushing a dented NYPD badge. From borough to borough, wherever a precinct once silenced complaints of abuse, there rose banners demanding buried files be exhumed. One night, in her third-floor office, Dorothy sat before an old computer monitor. On screen, a live stream of the plaza crowd rippled with each chant, "No more Brett, no more Shield, justice has teeth." She rested a thin hand on the real gavel, no cameras watching, no eyes to catch the raw glimmer wetting her lashes behind rimmed glasses, but not a single tear fell. Dorothy knew, from the second Brett's clipper bit her scalp, this was never about just her. This was the storm sweeping every filthy corner, where the wolves thought they'd lounge forever. The gavel had dropped, and this net, if it needed to shave a few more powerful heads raw, Dorothy was ready to raise it again. The city was waiting, and she had never missed a single hearing in her life. In the temporary holding cell, in the basement of District Court Number 4, Brett Kellens slumped against the cold wall, sunken eyes staring ahead, hands cuffed at his waist, yet the corner of his mouth still curled up every time news about the storm outside leaked in. He knew all too well. Someone like him only needed to keep quiet long enough, and the vultures who once fed off him would soon circle the fresh meat to keep their rotten power feast alive. And just as he expected, those beaks, addicted to the stench, had begun to stir. Out there, mid-ranking officers who had once pocketed Brett's envelope started whispering into the ears of nosy reporters. Just one line, light as a feather. Brett was nothing but a pawn, set up by Judge Ellis to whitewash her own filthy name. A few tabloids, surviving on scandal more than facts, wasted no time putting pen to paper overnight. By morning, bold headlines screamed, "Disgraced female judge, justice, or theater." The story ballooned like a nest of snakes hatching eggs. Late-night talk shows roared, "Who can guarantee a black woman from the poor labor district suddenly climbed to chief judge without connections in Congress? Has anyone verified her actual grades? Who did she sleep with to get a seat on the appeals bench?" People asked, then answered themselves with vicious speculation, then spun it into clumsy plots that the audience shared nonstop. In the courthouse office, Dorothy's personal clerk kept pulling out his phone, opening social media, shutting it, then opening it again. Each time the phrase "Dorothy Ellis scandal" popped up, his hands trembled. The closed meeting room reeked of stale coffee and freshly printed paper as the support lawyers huddled together, whispering strategies to salvage Dorothy's reputation before Brett's trial began. They quietly floated the idea of requesting a temporary suspension to calm public uproar, to stop the mob from tearing her apart further. Evan Tran, the young investigator, sat at the table's edge, face drained of blood. Just 3 weeks ago, his trembling hand had handed over the USB with evidence to convict Brett, in exchange for peace for his wife and kids. Now that filth was spilling out. His name could be dragged out any moment as an accomplice who helped Ellis fabricate a smear campaign against the police. Evan panted, avoiding Dorothy's eyes, secretly touching his breast pocket, where a withdrawal of testimony letter waited unsigned but ready to slip into an envelope and disappear. Dorothy sat at the head of the table, back straight, eyes sweeping over each pale face. She said nothing about the filthy hashtags out there. She simply signaled to open the laptop, pulled up folders proving her finances from 20 years as a prosecutor, then projected her original law school transcripts onto the screen. Each document landed like a nail hammered into the skulls of her slanderers. They had no evidence, only rumors, idle gossip, and cheap newspapers that would fade before the ink dried. When the clerk stammered, "Are you going to sue those papers? Hire a private lawyer?" Dorothy just curled her lips, hit the print button. The printer spat out page after page, salary slips, tax invoices, official emails from 15 years ago. She slammed the thick file on the table, her voice dry as steel. "This is my shield, but I need a sword too." She gestured for Evan to stand. Her eyes showed no blame, no encouragement, only a demand that he remember. It was his mouth that handed over the key to destroy Brett, no one else's. "You know exactly what Brett said that night. You recorded it. I didn't force you. You're a witness, not a pawn. If you stay silent now, who's going to save you from those vultures?" Evan lowered his head, choking out a soft yes before swallowing hard. Outside the window, a light drizzle fell. The office dimmed, only Dorothy's desk lamp illuminating her spot. In front of her, the tabloid with the headline, "Disgraced Female Judge Justice or Theater," was pinned down by the thick stack of files. Dorothy drew a deep breath, opened her drawer, pulled out a black-covered notebook, its edges worn. On the cover, a handwritten label read, "Black Book Kellen and Associates." Every page contained a leaked text snippet, a covert money address, a forced testimony. She flipped through each page, eyes narrowing like a blade slipping from its sheath. Thunder rumbled across the corrugated iron roof outside. Dorothy leaned back, studied the tabloid one more time, then let out a faint sneer. "Same old stench, filthier than I thought." In the darkness, only the rustle of pages turned could be heard, and her gaze froze on a name about to be dragged into the light alongside Brett tonight. And the whole flock of vultures, Dorothy swore, would have no feathers left to fly when she slammed her gavel again. On Monday morning, the front yard of District Court Number 4 swarmed like a beehive poked with a stick. Reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder, mics aimed every which way, camera lights flashing red nonstop. There was no official backdrop, no sensational banner. Amid the sun-drenched crowd stood only an old wooden podium, carried out by security and set right on the stone steps where Dorothy Ellis once stepped down after Brett Kellen's hearing. She appeared no judge's robe, no badge on her chest, just a woman with a patchy head of hair, a few silver strands bristling under the harsh sunlight. Beside her feet sat an open cardboard box, stuffed with thick files labeled in red, "Black Book Kellen and Associates." Cameras clicked, paused for a beat when Dorothy nodded in greeting, then whirred like flies drawn to fresh rot. She needed no MC to introduce her, no one to hold order. Her voice cut straight through the buzz, clear over a cheap mic. "Yesterday you heard plenty about how I bought my seat, took dirty political money. Today, I repay you with a truth far dirtier from the very people you've just defended." She bent down, pulled out the first stack of papers. Brett Kellen's signature loomed bold under special fund, an undeclared budget siphoned from the night patrol allocation. In the side notes, the names of certain officers now scurrying like sewer rats inside groups defending Brett. Reporters gulped audibly between camera clicks. "Whose money is this? Who received it? I have the originals. Do you want me to read them out loud?" Next, she held up an old testimony. In shaky blue pen, "I was forced to change my statement. Mr. Brett threatened my wife." She placed it flat on the podium, tapped her fingernail 3 times, eyes scanning the sea of lenses. "This witness is 40 meters away, inside a security vehicle. If you want, I'll call him out right now." The same reporters who, just this morning, planned to poke her with sleazy questions about Ellis sleeping with politicians, suddenly switched tone. They shoved mics at each other, zoomed in on every document she presented. Breaking headlines tore through social media like lightning. "Chief Judge Ellis drops Black Book on Brett, who's the real leech." A news channel that had slandered her most viciously the night before, scrambled by afternoon to take down their piece, uploaded an apology clip instead, splicing shots of her holding the file with a caption, "Justice's Diary, the True Record." Netizens grabbed every image, turned it into memes, quoting her line at the courthouse steps. "I didn't create Brett, you did. I just dragged him into the light." Meanwhile, at a police station, senior officers who once shook Brett's hand were slapped with urgent subpoenas. They no longer had time to worry about Brett. The so-called mafia lawyers, who had vowed to protect Brett at all costs, suddenly vanished like sea foam. In the cold cell, Brett knew he had been abandoned, and the smirk he once wore now echoed hollow inside his chest. A clip of Dorothy standing at the wooden podium, voice dry but unwavering, tapping her fingernail on the black book, crossed 1,000,000 shares in a single afternoon. People spread it not just to watch, but to comment, to remind each other, when old dirty tricks crawl back, only justice old enough can smash them down. When all the cameras had shut off, the podium cleared away by security, the crowd slowly dispersed under the dusk. Dorothy walked slowly down the long corridor, the sound of her heels echoing off the tiled floor. She returned to her office at exactly 8 in the evening, locked the door behind her, letting no one follow. In front of the mirror, she unclipped her hair, brushed back the ragged patches, eyes locking onto her own reflection. The dirty storm that had just struck left no dark circles, only faint lines creasing at the corners of her mouth as she chuckled softly. "Any dirty scheme can be washed clean if I still have my gavel and the crowd still believes in its sound." She leaned closer to the mirror, inspecting the fresh sprouts of hair bristling like weeds after a forest fire. That gaze needed no witness. It was a promise to Brett, to the vultures who once circled her. A promise that if more heads must roll, this gavel still strikes sharp, and this hand still has strength left. In the first days after the shocking reversal of her fate, District Court Number 4 was no longer the quiet courthouse that simply waited to hand down verdicts. Along its hallways, thick with the musty smell of old case files mixed with the bitter coffee, Dorothy Ellis still brewed every dawn. The air was tense, like a rope hidden beneath the presiding judge's gavel. Once pulled, it would tighten around the necks of all who once used the law's shadow to soil the law itself. Dorothy made no public statements, gave no lengthy interviews. She simply locked her office door and ordered her personal clerk to prepare a list of every case file Brett Kellen had ever handled cleanly over more than a decade. Inside the stack of yellowed folders, ink-smudged papers, wherever Brett's name appeared, there was always the scent of blood, tears, and frantic red pen marks crossing out truths. Each file laid bare a mask, a rainy night brawl with a young black man left motionless in a pool of blood, a single mother who vanished after reporting stolen CCTV footage, a few pages of evidence where the audio recording mysteriously didn't match. Cold lines of deposition notes, fragmented, half-sentences, witnesses flipping their testimony one after another. This was how Brett and his crew greased the machinery of violence this city chose to ignore. Dorothy sat through the night, fingers drumming on the wooden desk edge, eyes never straying from the numbers, addresses, and dates. She ordered her clerk to redraw the web connecting Brett to retired investigators, to politicians who once donated to police protection funds. Each arrow linking a name added another stain not easily scrubbed away. She decided not to wait for internal affairs, nor trust any inspection board still reeking of hush money. Dorothy invoked emergency authority, ordering the courthouse security team to work with private lawyers to quietly track down the new addresses of witnesses who had fled the city just to stay alive. A late-night news flash flickered on the old cell television. Black female judge reopens rotten cases, calls old witnesses to testify. In a damp corner, Brett Kellen crouched, fingers trembling as he tore at a cigarette wrapper but couldn't get it lit. His private lawyer, a so-called fixer, had just turned his back, leaving a crinkled newspaper fluttering to the tiled floor. Bold letters read, "Old witnesses ready to speak." Brett bit the mashed cigarette tip, trying to swallow its stale bitterness like he was choking down the burnt stench of a past he thought buried for good. He knew, this time, there would be no backroom deals, no one brave enough to shield him from the she-wolf wearing the judge's robe. The first message Dorothy got back from the witness hunting team was only a few words. "Found 3 so far. They agreed to return." She nodded, exhaling a long breath that seemed to purge every trace of gloom clinging to her chest since the night they shaved her head in humiliation. Among the familiar faces was a man named Randall Watts 3 years ago. His son was arrested for petty theft but died during transport. Brett wrote in the report, "Suspect banged his head on the squad car wall. Randall once cried himself dry, nearly doused himself with gasoline to set himself alight in front of police HQ. Then he vanished without a trace. Now, Randall stood at the courthouse waiting room door, long tangled beard, trembling hands, clutching an old death certificate. Next to Randall, a gaunt woman named Lorene Hayes held an envelope containing an old photo, her own bruised face from 10 years ago, next to a complaint she'd filed accusing Brett of threatening to kill her if she didn't drop her case. Lorene once collapsed at the interrogation table when Brett laid a gun on the desk, silently pointing at its loaded chamber. Further down the waiting room benches, a 17-year-old boy in a gray hoodie sat with swollen red eyes but squared shoulders. He was the son of a man wrongfully accused of drug dealing who died after leaving Brett's interrogation room. All his childhood, the boy only dared whisper his father's name in dreams. Now, with his own voice, he would recount what he'd seen through a crack in the door. Officer Brett Kellen laughing while his father, bound, was punched repeatedly in the chest, then filed under resisted search warrant. Oh, these faces masked, but with eyes that betrayed a newly ignited fire met Dorothy's calm nod as she passed by. She knew justice couldn't return lost lives or stolen childhoods, but at the very least, silence would no longer suffocate the files that still reeked of blood and fading ink. Outside, reporters waited to interview each witness. Crowds gathered at the courthouse gates, waving banners demanding a fair trial. Inside his cell, Brett Kellen doubled over, coughing violently, biting his lip until it bled. He knew, this time, every cuff would tighten not just on his wrists, but on the rotten power he once traded under this city's shadows. The district court number 4's interrogation room was no longer the quiet chamber where bored lawyers came to double-check paperwork. Now, every hour, every minute, it became a refuge for those Brett Kellen once shoved into the mud faces he thought silenced forever. Dorothy Ellis personally arranged each private session. No internal cop was allowed near the door while she was inside with a witness. She wanted every word, every truth buried for years, dragged out from throats dried by fear this time. No badge or black barrel would muzzle them again. A burly man, arms tattooed with faded gang marks, clutched a torn baseball cap, voice hoarse as he described the night Brett dragged him from his home, forced him to confess to drug possession to protect his 15-year-old sister. Every time he spoke her name, his calloused hand trembled violently, eyes barely holding back tears long turned to dust. Dorothy never interrupted, just listened, occasionally sliding him a cup of tea, a slow breath to keep him from collapsing mid-confession. But not everyone could peel back old wounds so easily. A woman once had her arm broken and a gun pressed to her head by Brett to force her to withdraw charges. Now a mother of 3, she sat quietly in the corner, eyes fixed on her worn shoes. Dorothy stepped over, gently placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice low but firm as a judge's gavel. "You're not alone. Every word you speak today will be a steel barricade, standing between them and your children's future." Some cried. Some sat silent as stone but signed their statements in the end. Courage spread like green shoots, cracking through concrete, hiding old sins. One sat down, another stood up. Leaks slipped through the courthouse walls, into reporters' ears, across thousands of phone screens. Each revealed witness's face, cut a fresh slash into the armor of power Brett once wore like an untouchable shield. Meanwhile, Brett, in his cell, had lost count of the nights. His cigarette dropped to the floor as he fumbled his phone, calling his lawyer. "Shut that news down. Erase the files. Fake the clips if you have to. Do anything." On the other end, the lawyer's voice was flat, robotic. "Brett, I'm not risking it with you anymore. Your own people sold you out. I'm only making sure my own case stays clean of your blood." He punched the wall, knuckles splitting open. The cronies he once protected with hush money had either vanished, quietly requested transfers, or secretly leaked files to the press as life vests. The shadow empire he deluded himself into ruling now rotted away beneath its owner's feet. Dorothy knew this. That night, as drizzle tapped her office window again, she sat alone, removed her glasses, rubbed her eyes to ease the ache from hours of confessions and tears. She crossed off witness names by hand, bold for those committed to testify, slanted for those wavering but likely to stand up. She shut her eyes, murmuring to herself, "This time, Brett Kellen will learn what justice feels like without silk wrapping. On the streets, news leaked like rain seeping into stone. Major outlets headlined, District Court Number 4 to Live broadcast showdown between ex-cop Brett Kellen and old witnesses. Comments exploded. The hashtag, shaves her head, morphed into Judge Strikes Back, pulling thousands to camp outside the courthouse. Food vendors mingled with signs reading, Justice for All. Masked youths streamed vlogs, narrating every move as courthouse security doubled their ranks. Behind thick brick walls, Dorothy sat straight-backed, her hand resting on the thick file of sworn statements. The muffled roar outside was a drumbeat urging her on. She knew, the moment those courtroom doors opened, the people once trembling under Brett's boot would stand tall, and the man who thought himself a wolf would learn, without a pack, the wolf is just a lone dog trapped in its own iron cage. A cold draft slipped under the door, carrying the damp scent of rain, paper, and human tension. Dorothy blinked, her lips pressing into a razor-thin smile, the smile of a woman once shorn bald in public, now carrying that scarred head back into a sea of people to pound her gavel and summon truths that never died. And this time, no one would dare silence her again. The hallway of District Court Number 4 at night remained unchanged. Long, dimly lit, yellow light lazily sweeping across dusty glass panels that reflected warped human shadows. The confidential meetings of the day had ended. Clerks and the security shift had rotated, leaving only a few scattered guards leaning against the walls, eyes heavy with sleep and the weight of what they had witnessed in the past week. Dorothy Ellis walked slowly, clutching a file folder still warm from fresh ink. On the deep red cover, the name Brett Kellen stood out like a knife blade pressed against the spine of the entire justice system she was painstakingly rebuilding. She knew well, the testimonies and old witnesses were enough to topple Brett, but to uproot the rotting power network he once clung to, she needed something heavier than blood and tears. She needed a living piece of proof, a dagger sharp enough to sever the silence that had choked this place for decades. As she passed the corner hallway leading to the rear exit, Dorothy stopped when she spotted a lone figure pressed against the stained wall, hugging a frayed folder tightly. The weak hallway light couldn't hide the tension radiating from the closed-off posture. She squinted. A very young face, distinctly East Asian features, a police uniform hurriedly concealed under a dark jacket. He stepped away from the wall, moving slowly toward her. Beneath his feet, the old tiles creaked strangely, like his heart was pounding too wildly to stay contained. Judge Ellis. His voice was hoarse, eyes carrying 1,000 unsaid words that almost choked back at the last second. Dorothy didn't reply, just nodded slightly, signaling him to go on. A bead of sweat slid down the young officer's temple. He gripped the battered folder so hard his knuckles turned white, then spoke loud enough for only them to hear, "My name is Evan Tran, from the Criminal Investigation Unit. 3 years ago, I was on the case of that black teenager in Grey Ridge Ward. The final report. I signed it, but that report wasn't true." Evan inhaled sharply, like trying to anchor himself in thin air. From inside his jacket, he pulled out a USB wrapped in a small Ziploc bag. Inside, the silver chip glimmered under the dim light, like an unexploded bullet. He murmured, "I hid this for 3 years. In the patrol car, Brett talked to me. He promised he'd leave me alone, promote me as long as I kept my mouth shut. He knew I'd just had a baby. My wife was sick then." A heavy exhale escaped him, dragging out the last of his courage. He bowed his head low, shoulders trembling like they were finally free from a boulder. "I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing my job, afraid my family would starve. I know I was wrong. But when I saw you, when he shaved your head in court, I knew I had no right to stay silent anymore." Dorothy's face didn't change. She extended her hand toward Evan, palm open like a funnel catching every sin he had just poured out. Evan looked at her, eyes a blend of shame and the faintest flicker of hope. Hope that this late betrayal would be washed clean enough for his conscience to sleep. When the USB changed hands, Evan withdrew his trembling hand, wiping the sweat off his knuckles. He lowered his voice to a child's whisper, fearing punishment. "Inside is a recording of Brett explaining exactly how he covered that up and how he promised to protect me if I kept quiet. I never thought I'd hand it to someone like you. But now, I have nowhere else to run." Dorothy closed her fingers around the USB, gripping it like the hilt of a sharpened knife. She didn't thank him. To her, Evan was no savior, just another gray pawn pushed back into place on the chessboard that justice had already set. Her voice was low, steady, like a judge's gavel striking wood. "You chose to stand on the side of justice. That means from now on, there is only forward. If you retreat, I can't guarantee anyone survives." Evan nodded, a crooked smile twitching on his lips. He glanced around the hallway one last time, as if checking whether Brett's shadow still lurked behind every foggy glass pane. When Dorothy turned away, his feet still couldn't move from the lit hallway, too afraid that one step turned back might draw an invisible bullet through his skull. But he did turn eventually, exhaling a breath that seemed to purge 3 years of weight from his lungs. The back door closed behind Evan Tran, the young detective who just burned his fear to become the final traitor. And in Dorothy Ellis's hand, that small chip had become a fresh blade, ready to slash off the last mask from Brett Kellen's empire. Dorothy shut her office door behind her. The click of the lock echoed sharply, cutting off the distant shuffle of patrolling boots. She set Evan's USB down on her desk, next to the pile of files still damp with the night rain outside the courthouse. For a fleeting moment, she just stared at it, weighing whether that tiny piece of metal could really bring down the web of rot Brett and his circle had spun so tightly. She didn't allow herself more doubt. Dorothy booted up her personal laptop, plugged in the USB. The screen blinked to life with a crude file name, Patrol, Car, Rec, MP4. She slipped on her headphones, leaned back in her chair, index finger trembling lightly on the mouse because she knew that one click would turn all of Brett's excuses into dust before the public. The static at the start sounded like Brett's own breathing as he leaned close to the driver's seat, whispering in Evan's ear 3 years ago. His voice was low, rough, breaking into an occasional sneer. "What you worried about, kid? I got this. Keep your mouth shut, and I'll get you into narcotics. Who doesn't want a quick promotion? So some punk knocks his own head on a wall, not your fault, right?" Dorothy kept her breathing steady, blinking slowly, gripping her chair arm tighter as Brett's words grew more brazen. Between the slimy promises were the names of veteran officers. "Captain Banks is in. Chief Phillips will slip an envelope to your wife. No taxes. Got it? Stick with me. I'll make you a boss. No more freezing your ass off on night patrol." The waveform pulsed on her screen, the patrol cars rumble in the background, amplifying Brett's threats like a curse etched deep beneath this badge and uniform. She pulled off the headphones, leaned back, took a deep breath. That breath carried her final decision. This won't rot away in a secure vault. It will be the nail in Brett's coffin, and if needed, in many others. Dorothy picked up her desk phone, dialing her crisis PR lawyer's private line. Her voice was rock solid. "Assemble the special media team. I'll split this file into segments. Tomorrow, release the first part. Every 3 days, release the next. Let the public rip their masks off, not me reading indictments by myself." Across the room, Evan sat hunched on the waiting chair, head buried in trembling hands. He had heard it all, with Dorothy, his uniform shirt soaked in sweat like he'd just stabbed himself before stabbing Brett. He looked up, pale but resolute. "Please, don't reveal my name. Don't put me out there. My wife, my kid, I can't protect them." Dorothy set the phone down and stepped closer. Her hand landed on his shoulder, the same hand that once trembled gripping the judge's gavel her first day on the high bench, now strong like the hand of someone who had risked everything to keep only one thing: faith in the law. "Evan, I know you're scared, but you can't step back anymore. If I don't name you, they'll silence you before I can shield you. Evidence is just metal. Only the living turn it into real judgment." Her words fell slow but cold as a dagger's edge. "You're on my side now, so you keep going. Justice hides no one behind locked doors anymore." Evan closed his eyes, nodded. In that instant, memories crashed back. 3 years ago, he had believed Brett was the model cop, the shield guarding grimy bar corners where Evan once loitered, watching punks scatter at Brett's gun. He once whispered to a colleague, "Brett's rough but brave, that's real police work," until Brett rested an arm on his shoulder, exhaled cigarette smoke, and hissed like venom, "Badges scare the poor, Don't be stupid. Evan's hand unconsciously opened before his eyes. Beneath his fingernails, red cracks marked how hard he'd clutched the USB's plastic bag. He realized everything he'd hoarded for 3 years was now the gavel falling on his own head before it fell on Brett's. Dorothy stepped back, clutching the USB like she was choking a live snake. She looked at Evan, but no longer saw just one trembling rookie. She saw everyone who'd ever been trampled under that dirty badge, a living piece, and as long as it spoke, justice had a way back. Outside the window, patrol lights swept the courtyard, driving the night's shadows to the far end of the hallway. Inside, Dorothy reminded herself, tomorrow, this city will hear them confess their own sins, not me. And on the tiled floor, Evan's step still faltered, but his heartbeat no longer raced like a fugitive's enters. He had chosen his side, and now he no longer walked alone. The third-floor interrogation room had never seen the footsteps of a district chief judge. This was a place meant for those who shuffled in with heads down, bombarded by internal investigators' rapid-fire questions, or where confessions cracked open under the harsh glare of a single yellow ceiling bulb. But tonight, the scarred wooden table and the crooked security camera bore witness to only 2 people. Brett Kellen, once the cocky cop no one dared cross, and Dorothy Ellis, the woman he once thought would beg him for mercy when his clippers shaved her head bare 3 weeks ago. Brett was brought in, wrists cuffed tight, raw red welts swelling around the steel. The uniform he'd worn at his arrest had long been stripped away, replaced by thin prison garb with a rumpled collar. His eyes were hollow, ringed black from sleepless nights, yet the corner of his mouth still fought to curl upward, as if that last shred of arrogance would outlast everything else. When Dorothy pushed the door open and stepped in, Brett shifted slightly, eyes straining to follow the shadow of her figure cast long under the table. She brought no bodyguard, no lawyer pounding the desk to intimidate. Only her and a thick folder clutched tight, paper edges jutting from its leather cover like small knives, ready to carve out whatever Brett still clung to. He let out a ragged laugh, hoarse and broken like rust scraped across metal. Well, the chief judge herself, come to lecture me, or gonna sentence me right here to save taxpayers the trouble? Dorothy said nothing. She sat down opposite him, her movements light as air, her gaze unwavering as she opened the folder. The first page listed new witnesses who had signed statements 3 days ago. Next, a transcript from the audio file Evan had handed over, the folder still bearing Brett's old red ink mark from when he'd signed off on a falsified report. The sound of pages turning was steady. Each sheet landing on the table pressed another invisible weight onto Brett's spine. Yet he kept trying to smirk, lips twitching. You think you can scare me with those nobodies? They'll say anything for money. You know that. Dorothy remained silent, only switching her pen hand to draw a calm line under the words, camera evidence missing witness withdrew complaint internal affairs closed case unusually. No accusations, no threats. She simply read, every line, every date, every checkpoint proving Brett was no victim of a smear but a festering tumor crawling beneath the polished reports once splashed on the front pages. Then Dorothy looked up, the ceiling light outlining the shadows under her eyes, but her stare was still cold as steel. She leaned slightly closer, voice flat and clear like a gavel that needed no bench. Remember that April night, Randall Watts's son? You signed the seizure order yourself, but the boy died in the patrol car, skull split open. Report says, suspect banged his own head on the window. Funny thing the window didn't break. Ho. Brett flinched, Adam's apple bobbing, lips forming a curse that only escaped as ragged breath. Dorothy flipped to the next page, and Lorene Hayes. You put a gun to her head, forced her to kneel, withdraw her assault claim. The tape aired. The whole city heard it. I don't need your confirmation. Peep eyes, Connor, 2-2. Connor Ace. I don't need your confirmation. Brett let out a choked, bitter laugh, now squealing like rusted brakes. I just did what I was told. Boss said clean up trash, so I cleaned. You sit there playing Lady Justice? Dorothy calmly closed the folder, tapping its spine lightly on the table, each tap a hammer on Brett's breastbone. Her voice dropped low, drawn out word by word, engraving itself into the concrete walls. I don't need your plea. I want you to know, every page here, every statement, every drop of blood you shed has become the rope tightening around your neck, and you have no hands left to pull it off. Oh, he slammed his cuffed fists on the table, eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal discovering its only exit was bricked shut. He tried to shout, but his throat choked on something raw bursting open inside his chest. Dorothy didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, eyes sharp as a final blade. The strong don't need to roar. The strong only need the truth, and you have neither. For the first time since his arrest, Brett didn't smile. His eyes dropped from her face, lingered on the cuffs biting his wrists, then slid off the table edge, drifting into the dark corner where the security camera's red light blinked quietly. His fingers trembled, lips pressed tight, his broad back, once a source of fear for countless suspects, now hunched like a child cowering behind a slammed door during his father's drunken rage. No one spoke. A single truth now filled the room. The fiercest wolf on Sutter Street didn't fear the judge's gavel, he feared facing his own reflection, defanged. Silence thickened after Dorothy's final words. Brett stayed frozen, chained hands gripping the table's edge until his knuckles blanched. For a long while, he didn't dare lift his eyes to meet the woman who had peeled away the armor he'd worn for 15 years in uniform. Dorothy still sat there, but her voice shifted no longer blade sharp, nor the bellow of prosecutors who'd failed to corner him before. Her tone was low, steady, like a prayer whispered gently, yet each word fell into Brett's ears like stones rolled across his chest. She told him things he hadn't heard from his soundproof isolation cell, about Evan, the rookie he'd once slapped on the back promising, "You'll be boss in no time," now betraying him with the same trembling voice from 3 years ago. She spoke of the recording broadcast minute by minute, chewed up by reporters, public opinion reshaping Brett into a beast in uniform, pocketing bribes, smirking while the helpless flinched under his fists. Brett's roar cut her off. He smashed his cuffs against the table, breath hissing through clenched teeth like a dying animal gasping for air. "Bastards! Evan's a bastard. He sold me out for what? A promotion you gave him? Those scum reporters. Every one of them is garbage." He spit out curses between ragged wheezes, eyes bulging, but even as he raged, his voice cracked. The fury couldn't lift his snarl anymore. A sob escaped, arrowing straight through his ribs. Brett covered his face, giggled madly, but the tears betrayed him, sliding from the corner of eyes that once terrified half the city. Dorothy leaned forward, tone still calm, eyes now a pitiless void. "Cursing Evan is pointless. He chose to survive. The witnesses are solid. The files are signed. Evan's tape has gone nationwide. Even if I let you die silent in prison, the truth lives out there." "Oh." Brett looked up, eyes bloodshot, throat rattling like an old dog kicked in the gut. "Enough. Enough. You want me dead, don't you? Just stab me. I'm not scared." Dorothy shook her head slowly, closing the folder. She didn't act like a victor. She had only one final request. Soft as casual small talk, yet it cut away the last feeble brace in Brett's chest. "I don't need your confession. Everything's complete. I just want to hear you say one thing. Why did you choose to become a monster? One sentence, then I'm gone. You'll never see my face again." Her question fell into the cold air, bounced off peeling walls, and folded back into Brett's ears. He clenched his teeth, head barely shaking, but his eyes drifted to the camera's unblinking red dot. A long silence stretched. The rattling breath turned into quiet whimpering, tainted with stale tobacco smoke ghosts. Then his voice cracked out rough, frail, the pitiful mumble of a child behind a rotten door as his father slammed his mother against the kitchen floor. "I just wanted to fear someone less than I feared myself." Dorothy's eyes blinked once, but no tears broke free. She stood, folded the folder like closing the final door, between her and the man who had made hundreds tremble at the sound of a night patrol siren. Brett stayed hunched, wide shoulders shriveled, back bent like a beggar, stripped of crutch and armor. Dorothy said nothing more. She turned, opened the door, and the hallway's yellow light flooded in, swallowing her retreating silhouette. Inside the soundproof room, Brett didn't scream, didn't curse. He had no fangs left to threaten anyone. The security camera's red dot kept blinking, recording the image of an old wolf who had bitten off his own teeth, leaving behind only one thing echoing off 4 walls. Truth bleeding, but sharp as a blade. The 6 a.m. news broadcast a clipped segment straight from the interrogation room. Brett Kellen's face ghost white, lips stammering through broken confessions, words splintered like an animal being skinned alive under the cold ceiling light. Citizens watching at home clapped, comment sections exploded. But elsewhere, deep within the concrete walls of the Sutter District Police Department, the air thickened like a silent prison cell. The same officers who once slapped Brett's back in the hallway after each clean wrap-up now kept to the shadows, avoiding each other's eyes. In the break room, the coffee had gone cold long ago, and no one bothered to reheat it. Only muttered curses drifted through the stale smoke, drowned out by cell phones buzzing relentlessly across grimy tables. An internal affairs inspector named Wilson rushed down the corridor, a file wedged under his arm, phone pressed hard to his ear. His voice hissed through gritted teeth. "No, I said burn those files first. Did you hear me? I'll pay double, just shut up and stay quiet." The call cut off with a ragged exhale. Wilson pressed his back to the wall, sweat sliding down his spine like a gun barrel against his neck. That same evening, in a dark corner of a bar where they once toasted to victories, a few lieutenants, minor captains, and seasoned case officers huddled over cheap booze and stale sweat. They ignored the droning jazz and whispered the same 3 words on repeat: run, hide, muzzle. One flicked ash from his cigar, another tapped stray embers off the table, eyes darting, then dropping again. No one dared speak up. Everyone knew, when one wolf falls, the rest tear each other apart for the last shred of fur to cover their own throats. A morning paper lay on the table, headline in bold: Evans' files leaked, Brett loses protection network. It sat like an ice-cold dagger pointed at each throat around that table. In the bar's shadow, an old lieutenant named Carson, who used to sit side by side with Brett at every Black Fund party, reached under his jacket and pulled out a stuffed envelope. He scanned the group, voice rough but sharp. "I copied the original's internal case files. If you want to live, you come with me. I spoke to the chief judge's lawyers. She promised protection in exchange. We spill everything." A young rookie, eyes still red from being slapped by his superior the day before, sneered. "You really think she trusts you? She'll use you as bait, then dump you." Carson slammed his hand on the table, face flushed. "I'd rather be squeezed dry and still breathing than swing from the same rope as Brett." The laughter died instantly. In that bar, reeking of rotting floorboards, the air grew thicker than the smoke. Every glance flicked like a blade. One slip, and brothers at the same table would tear each other's throats out for an escape route. Just then, the door creaked open. A tall figure, hood pulled low, drifted silently to the bar. No one recognized him at first, but beneath that dark coat, his hand subtly shifted a phone, camera aimed squarely at the whispering officers plotting to switch sides. His eyes glimmered under the dim light, lips curling slightly. "I trust no one. I need my own insurance." A few realized who he was, hearts clenching tight. It was Glover, once draping an arm around Brett like a brother, notorious for playing both sides. He sipped cheap beer, thumb brushing the bright red record button inside his pocket. Outside, Sutter Street stayed noisy with honking cars and flickering neon lights. But inside, Brett Kellen's dusty spiderweb was tearing thread by thread. Each cop at that table clawed at the rotten limbs still tethering them to him. Everyone wanted out before the blade of public outrage and the gavel of the court came down squarely on their own skulls. And that night, in a smoky corner, the first crack spread from the rim of an overflowing beer glass, the stale breath of cheap whiskey, and the sly, hidden recording of a two-faced man. The wolves smelled their own blood first, and what they feared most wasn't the street crowd outside, it was each other. By dawn, when pale sunlight slid over the rusted gate of the Sutter District Police HQ, Dorothy Ellis was seated neatly in her private lawyer's office. Before her lay a neat stack of yellow envelopes, sealed with brittle old tape. She flipped each one open with a delicate hand, careful not to tear the fragile trust each anonymous courier had slipped through her mail slot all night. Inside, shaky, handwritten lines. "I saw him take envelopes. I was so scared. Please don't name me. I don't want to end up like Daniels last year." Dorothy smoothed each page, needing no tears to feel her palm burn hot. She knew. Brett Kellen fell not just by his own hand, but because the rats who once feasted in the shadows with him now gnawed at each other's throats for one last breath of safety. Meanwhile, Upstairs in the smoked glass offices of HQ, the air was stale with cigarettes and fists pounding cheap desks. The same officers who used to swagger with Brett, sneer at reporters asking about excessive force, now flinched from camera crews, heads down when lenses hunted them. Reporters didn't back off, camping by squad cars, jamming mics through half-cracked doors, snapping any shot of a frayed uniform hurrying down cold brick halls. Within a single morning, 3 lieutenants quietly filed for indefinite leave, 2 division heads called in sick, and 1 man once the loudest to hail Brett as a legendary enforcer vanished from the city, leaving behind an empty desk. But not everyone escaped in time. A portly, graying commander named MacArthur, once called Brett's Iron Shield, now sat hunched in an emergency interrogation room, sweating buckets, fidgeting with a tarnished wedding ring. "I'll cooperate. I'll hand over the list. Everyone who split hush money, buried footage, silenced witnesses, I know it all. I won't die like Brett." Across from him, one of Dorothy's attorneys scribbled notes, making no promises of absolute safety, only the minimum. "You talk enough, you stay breathing." Word of MacArthur's betrayal spread like gasoline over a flame. An emergency boardroom meeting turned into an open pit of panic. Leather chairs squeaked, fresh files slammed hard on the long table. A furious lieutenant barked, face purple. "You people want to make this department a joke?" Brett was framed just a pawn in that judge's game. A young investigator, once terrified of Brett, slapped Evans' recording onto the table. "Then this is fake? Who here didn't hear Brett's filth? Who didn't see him stuffing envelopes down junior pockets?" The shouting spiraled into curses. The head of internal security smashed a bloody fist on the table, roaring, "Anyone still backing Brett just signed their own death warrant." A minute of raw silence followed the blast. Every pair of eyes darted around. Brotherhood was gone. Brett's boys were no more. Only fear remained dripping down sweaty shirt collars. Outside HQ gates, crowds swelled. Banners stretched across the street. Justice's hammer, not gilded. Posters of Dorothy's gavel striking at Brett's interrogation session flapped across iron fences. A ragged little boy held up a cardboard sign in tiny hands. "Teach me to trust the police. Punish them fair." The climax came at day's end. A wide-angle camera stared directly into the HQ boardroom. Under flickering tube lights, a row of officers once hand-picked by Brett bowed their heads, one by one signing cooperation statements. A new prosecutor, hair salted with gray, stood beside them, face cold as an unbroken glacier. The door cracked open. Street noise flooded in chants, car horns, a megaphone spitting out a short bulletin. Official probe launched into Dirty Cop Network. Justice wears no armor now. Justice will wear light. From her office window blocks away, Dorothy Ellis saw it all, fingertips resting on Brett Kellen's old battered file. A crack in the darkness had spread all the way down to the concrete roots that once shielded Sutter's wolves. And this time, those walls would crumble without fanfare, just the slow, steady pound of a judge's gavel, needing no blood to dye the hope of the crowd outside any redder. The heavy steel door of the solitary block creaked open right on time every morning, its hinges screeching like fingernails scraping an old mirror. Brett Kellen, once a barked command in a hallway, was enough to make rookie cops stand rigid as iron, now hunched on his cold wooden bunk, prison shirt soaked with stale sweat. In front of him, the prison warden slammed down a fresh stack of files on the chipped wooden desk, reading aloud in a flat, indifferent tone. Additional charges: falsifying crime scene reports, destroying evidence, threatening witnesses, obstructing due process. Each word clawed at Brett's eardrums like iron nails. The pile of subpoenas stacked high as bricks, bricking up a new tomb for the power empire that once sheltered him for years. Every page of blue ink print dragged another sleepless night out of him. Another ring deepened under his eyes. Another tremor flickered through fingers once quick to slap on handcuffs, now cuffed on him, by him. But the worst blow wasn't in that fresh stack. It came at midday news, leaked from an internal file someone had slipped out. Brett Kellen, the iron fist of Sutter's streets, was caught personally editing security camera footage, caught on tape deleting frame after frame at his own desk. In the reporter's reenactment, timestamps crystal clear, his fingers struck the delete key like knocking on Hell's Gate, trying to bury every trace of his crimes. Before he could swallow that choking bile, Brett heard a name he thought buried, a scrawny young man who once sobbed outside the police station, begging to withdraw his complaint so his elderly mother wouldn't have an accident. Brett thought that kid had fled the city forever. Now, there he was, live on television, facing the camera, fingers stabbing forward. "He pressed a gun to my mother's head. He swore he'd shoot if I didn't sign the withdrawal." Inside his cell, Brett roared. His fists smashed the concrete wall until skin split, blood smeared red streaks on the cold gray blocks, like the ash of old cases where he'd buried real bodies and forged fake ones. His iron fists pounding the wall couldn't drown out the dry flutter of fresh indictments sliding off the desk, falling like bricks from the tomb he was building himself. He rasped the names of men who once drank with him, pocketed his envelopes, swore to cover his back. "Where are you? You promised you'd shield me. You promised. Traitors, every one of you." Each shout died quicker than the last, his voice cords fraying one fiber at a time with every worthless plea. He repeated one line, hoarse, back pressed to the wall, eyes wide like a cornered wolf. "It's all a setup, all a setup, all..." But the four walls around him held no ears to believe, fear, or pity. Outside the bars and concrete, the world was anything but quiet. Brett's stink rose like a carcass rotting too long under the sun. News stations ran segment after segment, unpacking every detail. Legal experts, retired inspectors, old victims lined up to pile on the truth. Brett wasn't just one bad apple, he was the entire nest of termites hollowing out the badge's meaning for decades. Hashtags Dirty Cop and Justice for All trended at the top. Old secret clips surfaced Brett barking orders, beating suspects, spitting on a young black man inside a holding cell. Every frame fractured Sutter Street's brittle faith in justice knocking at your door. Amid the public uproar, a third criminal indictment dropped, new charges for evidence tampering. This one even the fattest defense lawyer couldn't spin. A sentence heavy enough to keep Brett in a cell far longer than any hush money deal he'd ever signed under the table. In the damp isolation block, Brett heard this from the warden's mouth. He didn't pound the wall anymore. His eyes gaped wide, lips twitched like trying to laugh, but no breath came. Every rebuttal rotted on his tongue, falling to the cold floor under his cot. Somewhere in that bruised skull, the Brett Kellen who once stormed through rain-soaked alleys with a steel baton had died. All that remained was a hunched prisoner, sweat-soaked in fear, no longer dreaming of pardons, no hope of appeal, just waiting for the final gavel to swing down like an axe promised since the day he first clipped footage to hide the truth. Dorothy stepped out of her office, fresh stack of printed files tucked under her arm, walking straight into the district courthouse's sealed meeting room. At the head of the table, the federal prosecutor sat waiting, fingers tapping a crimson folder, eyes blinking quick, counting down the hours to drag Brett Kellen into open daylight. No more backroom calls, no more confidential handshakes. Dorothy opened cold. "We'll try him as an example. No suspended sentence, no deals. Open calendar, live streamed, so this city sees how darkness fears the light." Across the table, the prosecutor nodded, pen slicing across the case acceleration plan. The legal net now squeezed not just Brett, but any name floating in his bonus envelopes for the past decade. Within 24 hours, the trial date was headline news. But the bigger quake came from people who once cowered behind locked doors. A cluster of victim families once hidden away in shabby rentals, terrified of midnight knocks, sudden accidents, now marched right up to the courthouse steps. An old man, hands shaking around a framed photo of his 19-year-old son, voice shredded by a decade of cheap cigarettes and swallowed rage, squared up to a dozen lenses. "He killed my boy. Said he resisted, his hands were cuffed. Today, I want to see him behind iron bars." A young mother clutched her daughter, recounting every threat, every hush payment, every dollar squeezed to gag her voice. Each testimony slammed another crack into the rotten concrete wall named Brett Kellen. Fear was gone. They'd waited 10 years, 20. Now that the gavel struck, they'd be the next hammer, pounding truth into daylight. The chain reaction spread like fire across dry grass. Mid-level officers, who once split hush funds and holiday envelopes, lined up to secretly hire lawyers. Some begged the prosecutor for plea deals. Others sent anonymous emails to Dorothy's team offering more footage, more recordings, hoping to dodge secondary charges. The wolf pack now scrambled like sewer rats as their burrow lay gutted under floodlights. And Brett Kellen once pounding his chest in backroom bars, bragging no lawyer dares open my files, now curled up like a sick dog in solitary, his hair tangled, stubble sprouting patchy, the stench of sweat mingling with piss-stained concrete. His eyes flickered blank, widening every time night shift boots scraped past his door. Each night, Brett jolted awake, curling into the cot's corner, mumbling prayers to be moved to another block, terrified the old inmates he'd beaten, framed, double-crossed, might shank him just to settle old blood debts. Some nights, he pressed his face to the bricks, whispering his old crew's names like a madman summoning dead wolves to shield him from this endless black. When lucid, Brett clawed at the wall with broken fingernails, scratching out a cracked web of names, dates, hush-money sums, numbers blurred beneath split nail beds, caked in dried blood. He babbled to the concrete, "I can't die yet. I know too much. You need me. You need me." But the mildew-soaked dark answered only with drip-drip leaks, a ticking clock counting down to a verdict with no bargain left. Outside the bars, news outlets rolled out fresh posters, "The Day Justice Judges Sutter's Dark." Brett's bowed head behind bars, set beside Dorothy's battered yet defiant profile under courthouse lights. The entire city inhaled as one, waiting to see how hard the final nail would hammer down, ensuring Brett's vultures would never crawl free again. From self-proclaimed alpha wolf to a broken mutt on a chain, Brett now waited in the square of public judgment, and in that square, the hammer of justice was wound tight, ready for its final swing to shatter the rotting fangs once called order in Sutter's shadows. The night had swallowed every echo outside the row of holding cells in the district security block. A crooked fluorescent tube on the ceiling flickered weak yellow light, casting moldy stains across the cracked walls like old fungus come alive. The damp stench of concrete mixed with the acrid odor of human sweat and flesh confined too long, clinging stubbornly to the thin, frayed blanket thrown in the corner of the iron cot. Brett Kellen curled up in that exact spot, filthy shoes tucked tight against his stomach like a frightened child warding off the cold. His thin prison shirt did nothing to hide the bruises on his shoulder or the red blotches circling his neck, ugly souvenirs from the day he'd been dragged out of his office, cuffed, face smashed to the stone floor in front of the same eyes that once lowered themselves when he strutted past. At first, Brett still braced himself like a wounded old dog, determined not to whimper in front of the new wolves rotating shifts outside his door. He held his face blank, eyes blinking slow, lips pressed tight, spine glued to the wall, as if leaning hard enough would stop the crumbling fortress of power from crushing through his bones. In his mouth, ragged mutterings looped like a broken mantra. "It's just for now, Brett. You taught them to bow, they'll find a way to pull you out. Just a pawn. A good pawn never gets tossed aside." But the steady drip from a leaking pipe in the corner didn't pity him. Each drop landed into a spreading gray puddle, splitting the silence with a countdown curse. His shadow, under the cold hallway beam through iron bars, stretched long across the stained tiles and splintered into grotesque shapes, twisted, just like the shredded case files he'd buried beneath safe boxes in exchange for fat envelopes stuffed in his desk drawer. He squeezed his eyes shut, tried to drown memory like he once drowned heads in gutter puddles, but the images surfaced sharper than mold stench. Dorothy's calm, merciless eyes under the falling strand of silver hair returned clear as daylight. No plea, no flinch of fear. His lifetime of intimidating with fists and a badge cast in brass was buried in that woman's gaze, twin mirrors reflecting every filth he'd once crowned as power. Memory cracked wide open like a burst dam. He saw himself young 19, a brawny rookie facing a bread thief. The thief quivered, cuffs loose, eyes darting. Brett, still believing himself a hero then, threw the first punch, breaking the man's nose, blood soaking his gloves, salty with the stink of scalp sweat. He discovered a wicked thrill. The second hit came harder, the third boot to face on the curb, a crowd cheering brave cop, strong arm, model officer. After that night, Brett was hooked. Addicted to terrified whimpers, downcast eyes, the coins filling his pockets, the handshakes wrapped in righteous theater. He stopped telling crime from poverty, stopped caring who he was allowed to beat and who he chose to crush underfoot. The drip kept falling. Brett lurched up like a man shot, fists pounding the floor, his knuckles cracked dry against cold cement. A smear of blood bloomed along a torn nail. He didn't feel pain, only a burning chest, throat choking like a toothless wolf trying to howl but only rasping air. Curses broke into jagged syllables, dragging tremors through his whole frame. He tried to brace himself, but the tears slid anyway, leaking down cracked lashes. The darkness gnawed through the armor of bad cop he'd clung to half his life. One thought flared, ripping through all excuses he'd fabricated. Brett Kellen, you are the most spineless bastard in this city. You spent years terrified, so you wore the badge to scare the world instead. Outside, a guard's boots scraped down the hallway, but no one paused to listen to his choking sobs. Inside the mold-bitten walls, Brett collapsed onto the cold tile, back hunched, hands covering a wet face while the endless night devoured every last defense of the man once crowned the alpha wolf. He leaned into the corner, breath dragging stones through his chest. He stared up at the patchy ceiling, rain mold bleeding greenish veins across flaking plaster. A fat cockroach lumbered along a cracked seam. Its shadow slid across Brett's pupils. He flinched to swat it away, but his hand dropped limp, halfway no strength left to wave off a bug, let alone the shame sinking into his marrow. His eyes stayed dry, but his mind bubbled over with faces those who vanished from Sutter's streets while he smirked behind the patrol wheel. The boy collapsing in rain, gasping "Mom," while Brett stomped his face on the sidewalk just to lock down a bar corner he liked. The single mother, hunched on a bench outside interrogation, gnawing her fingertip to keep from being pinned with resisting arrest. Each face, each silent stare layered like ghosts clawing past his skull, ripping the last scraps of arrogance. How many fake reports had he signed? How many nights did he slide hush envelopes off greedy lawyers for a nod to bury footage? Did he even remember how many rookies he silenced with a hissed threat? Want to get reassigned to South End, rookie? Now it all flooded back like a swamp bursting its banks, drowning his lungs. The only sound he could hear was his own lungs wheezing like a trapped animal. He gripped his head, shoulders bracing as if his spine would snap. One breath, two, then a sob broke through his clenched teeth, small at first, like mice scuttling under rotted floorboards, then shaking him in gut-twisting spasms. He bit down to kill the sound, slammed his fists into his chest, tearing his thin prison shirt, skin scraped raw, sweat souring fresh blood. The iron ankle shackle clinked with every strike, a cruel echo. You cuffed them, now you're chained too. He didn't know when the tears started. Salt dribbled to his cracked lips, stinging the bruise under his chin. Brett buried his head in his knees, mumbling feverish nonsense. I just wanted someone to see me as a hero. His voice rasped, splitting like a rib under a boot. Each word lumped in his throat, breath gasping like a stray dog crawling through a storm. He'd once craved applause from teammates, superiors, wide-eyed cadets. He'd felt untouchable, towering over low-necked street folk. Now, under this sputtering ceiling light, he was just another criminal, no more, no less, and no one nodded politely when Brett Kellen passed anymore. Outside the bars, the patrol lights swept once and faded. Only the flickering tube hummed. A burly guard paused, peering in at Brett, curled in filthy bedding like a starved cur in a back alley. The guard watched a moment, Brett sobbing, face buried, then turned away. No reassurance, no pity. In their eyes, Brett Kellen was just a corpse waiting for judgment, nothing more. His sobs cracked into coughs, then ragged breaths. He pressed swollen fists to his face, teeth sinking into his knuckles to silence himself, but it was far too late. Everything he'd hidden for years, the fake pride, the night wolf costume, dissolved like wet newspaper, peeling apart strip by strip. He wondered, just for a moment, what if anyone had whispered back then, "Brett, you're becoming a monster." But no one did. No one stopped him. Everyone needed him to clean their filth without dirtying their own hands. In the faint gloom, only Brett's stuttering breath and the clink of iron chain mixed with broken sobs. The wolf who once fancied himself master of the night now cried like a child too young to fear the dark. The long night swallowed him whole, and no answer came. Only a draft slipped through the door crack, brushing over hair gone prematurely gray on a man who once thought he was invincible, now begging, too late, for a scrap of peace. The prisoner transport siren wailed in sharp bursts, ripping apart the road just drying from the dawn mist. March sunlight carried a brittle chill, making the air outside the gates of District Court No. 4 feel tight, drawn in. Reporters crowded both sides of the entrance, microphones aimed like loaded pistols ready to fire the second those steel doors swung open. They waited for that moment, the wolf of Sutter Street, once the man who made others kneel and hush to appear shackled like any other convict. Inside the transport van, Brett Kellen hunched on the cold steel bench, hands cuffed in front of his gut. His back sagged like a bursting sandbag, only the frayed prison shirt covering the bloated body fed for years on booze and unchecked power. Patchy stubble clung to his jawline, trembling with each pothole the van jolted over. The reek of rust, sweat, and raw gasoline tangled in his nose, turning his stomach. When the van braked hard at the courthouse steps, a bead of cold sweat clung to the nape of his neck, crawling down like an ant searching for escape. He rolled his eyes to the tiny barred window. Dozens of lenses rose like dry grass waiting for a spark. Old instincts urged him to tilt his chin up, shoot that defiant glare that once made street trash bow deep. But his neck locked instead. His shoulders twitched. A vein at his temple pulsed like a door knock, inviting the darkness back into a skull already cracked. Two guards dragged Brett out. He let them grip him, push him up the stone steps, his feet heavy as sacks of stone. Flashbulbs popped in his eyes, making him squint. Under the blade-like chill of morning sun, Brett Kellen, once swaggering Sutter's streets like a proud beast, now hauled his own shadow up the tiled hallway, chains clinking at his wrists. The courtroom was packed, press seats jammed tight, mics hot, spare batteries lined up. Scattered through the audience sat faces Brett once thought long rotted in old case files. A father, a mother, a mason missing a finger because Brett needed an alibi for a paying client. Their eyes on Brett showed no glee, no spit of pity, only a patient stillness, like waiting to hear one last bad joke from a clown who'd dragged the act on too long. Dorothy Ellis sat high above, the judge's chair hugging her slight frame, spine straight as iron. Overhead lights laid bare the tufts of regrown hair across the scars Brett himself had tried to humiliate her with months ago. Her black robe draped to her collar, but her eyes stayed uncovered, flat and steady as a bronze gavel ready to strike. Brett was dragged to the witness stand. His legs screamed, but he forced himself upright, chains tapping the wood with a soft metallic clink, sharp as a choked sob swallowed back down. He flicked his eyes around, hoping for a familiar look, a scrap of sympathy, a sliver of regret to comfort him that someone still believed he could be sorry. He swallowed dry, words cracking out like air from collapsed lungs. I know I did things wrong. Each syllable tore like sloppy stitches. His eyes flickered, begging for a nod, a blink, anything to lie to himself that his apology meant something. But the room stayed mute. Just the scratch of pens, a weary exhale from a reporter bored with old confessions. A child holding his mother's hand shook his head gently, eyes round, as if staring at a pitiful stray rather than the monster the livestream called him. Dorothy watched him. Her eyes were a mirror plane, exact, reflecting him back with nothing added, nothing taken away. She didn't interrupt, didn't interrogate. That silence hollowed Brett's ribs deeper than any curse could. He sucked in air, chest fluttering like a vein about to burst, and forced out a final, breathless scrap. "I'm sorry." The last word drifted up, like the cigarette smoke he used to puff on stakeouts, hunting down poor folks in the streetlight haze. No one caught that word. It floated, brushed the ceiling, then fell to the tiled floor and shattered like a beer bottle he once smashed over a suspect's head just to feel powerful. Brett lowered his head. Cold chains bit into his bruised wrists, but the chill inside his bones gnawed deeper than any sentence could. In that heavy room, an apology died as quiet as a Sutter midnight back when Brett Kellen thought no one could touch the wolf stalking the dark. Dorothy turned the final page of a case file thick as a headstone, pressing on every chest present. Her voice broke the hush, not loud, not soft, but each word slapped Brett's ribs clean. Brett Kellen, defendant before this court today, stands convicted of severe abuse of power, assault of civilians, coerced testimony, destruction of criminal evidence, intimidation of witnesses, and perjury before prosecution. Each charge fell like bricks, rebuilding the justice wall he'd spent 20 years corroding with his polished badge. Cold sweat trickled down Brett's spine, slipped along the metal cuffs, dripped onto the tile floor. He didn't flinch, but his eyes fogged like a dusty car mirror reflecting Dorothy, the woman he'd once sworn he could pin face down like any street scum in Sutter's back alleys. Dorothy didn't spare him another heartbeat. She turned her gavel in her palm like a latch, closing the last gate on Brett's worthless illusions. Based on proven charges and witness testimonies, I, under the authority of District Court Number 4, sentence Brett Kellen to imprisonment without parole and order extended investigation into all his accomplices. The gavel struck 3 short, heavy blows, echoing like stones tumbling from a rotted roof onto a cold courtyard. The air held its breath, then fractured under sparse, steady applause from the back rows. No cheers, no shouts, just claps nailed down like coffin nails, sealing the last shred of pride in a man who thought himself above law. Brett's neck sagged. His eyes emptied, a pond drained to show rotting sludge at the bottom. He heard the gavel, the claps, the guard's sharp breath beside him, every detail stabbed sharp through his skull, but nothing stuck except the gaping void where once he stuffed badges, bribes, and the tremble of fearful bows. Among the crowd, an old man clutched a faded photo, a 17-year-old boy pinned under Brett's arm in an old report labeled "Suspect Resisting Arrest." The man neither clapped nor wept, just stared at Brett as if looking at a wild animal caged up for a traveling freak show. In another seat, a widowed woman bit her lip to blood, tears circling dry eyes, unsure if they mourned her dead husband or the night Brett pressed a gun to her temple, whispering she'd better forget, or her son would spend every month answering subpoenas. Dorothy snapped her file shut, the leather cover thudding harder than her gavel's final strike. She stood, spine unbent, the robe brushing the table's edge, exposing that stubborn patch of regrowing hair once stripped away for shame, now crowned as justice itself. She walked past Brett. He tilted his head, hoping her gaze might meet his, just once, to catch that sorry excuse for an apology before it dissolved on the floor. But Dorothy didn't stop. Her eyes cut clean over him, aimed dead ahead toward the doors, spilling morning sun like a sword down the damp hall. Outside, reporters swarmed her, mics thrust forward. "Judge Ellis, are you satisfied with this verdict? Will more be indicted? Any comment on Brett Kellen's apology?" Dorothy waved them off, voice level but iron. "The court has spoken. Justice is done. From now on, the gavel strikes when needed, never out of fear." Behind her, guards wrenched Brett's arms, steering him into the flashbulb storm. He twisted back, praying for a last glimpse of that black robe and ragged hair turning his way, just a glance to feel human for one final second. But Dorothy was gone, swallowed into the sea, waiting at the courthouse gates. The van door slammed shut. The iron latch scraped Brett's ears like the razor edge he once pressed against that woman's skull. He swallowed hard, chest clamped by an invisible fist. An apology had been spoken far too late for anyone to bother catching it. A wolf in chains is just a mutt barking at shadows behind bars, nothing more. Monday morning, just as the sun lifted behind the roof of District Court Number 4, the old stone steps outside were still jammed tight with bodies, some holding scrappy cardboard signs, others raising high posters of Dorothy Ellis, her patchy, regrown hair now an unshakable legend. Inside, the hallway swarmed with cameras. Reporters drifted like restless birds, breath held for the next tremor to break the calm. Brett Kellen had been sentenced, but his aftershock didn't vanish with the slamming of his cell door. In her corner office, Dorothy Ellis sifted through a stack of government correspondence freshly handed over by the public intake desk. White envelopes, crisp seals, smudged signatures blurred by drizzle at the gate. One envelope, no name, no stamp, yellowed paper sealed crudely with packing tape. She paused, brow furrowed. Beside her, her young secretary, still green but already trained to sniff danger, leaned in. "Let me check that one first, ma'am." Dorothy brushed his hand aside, voice calm as always. "Go check the civil reports for me. This one, I'll read myself." The paper blade sliced the seal clean. A single thin sheet slipped onto the scratched wooden desk. Typewritten words, misaligned, some letters smudged with damp. One bare-boned sentence, no greeting, no sign-off, no petty threats like a street punk's scrawl, but the chill coiled in those streaked letters. "Think you can control the wolves just because you caged one dog? One day you'll share its grave." Dorothy didn't blink. She sat still, letting the paper lie flat against the grooved wood. Outside, the shuffle of guards swapping shifts echoed, mingling with a reporter's tinny voice reciting the newest headline, Judge Dorothy Ellis set to reopen ghost cop gang case. But the racket couldn't pierce the silence hanging between her and the slip of menace on her desk. The secretary's breath snagged in his throat as he peeked over her shoulder. He stammered, "Ma'am, you should take a leave, relocate at least, or let me call in a special security team. If not, they'll—" He never finished. Dorothy folded the note sharply, like slicing an invisible rope that had tried to coil round her ribs. "You think Brett was scarier than the night they shaved my head? One dirty scrap of paper can't match the blade that stripped me to the scalp." Her tone wasn't loud but struck like a gavel cracking oak, freezing the secretary mid-breath. The ghost of Brett, those halls he stalked, those nights he yanked a mother's child by the hair to break her lies, all blew past Dorothy's mind like a cold gust. She let it pass, untouched. The night her silver hair fell in clumps at her shoes, Brett's sneer still hissed in her ear. That night's humiliation and blood had scrubbed away every layer of sweet lies that dirty power once painted on her skin. That was the night Dorothy Ellis rebirthed herself into a new door, a door the wolves now fear, no longer a passage for their fangs to sink deeper into the innocent. She laid the envelope atop the thick file, Brett's name and his co-conspirators, waiting to ignite the next courtroom reckoning. Proof that while the fangs had been pulled, claws still scraped in the city's shadows, howling nightly for old blood to lick. Dorothy had no plan to flee behind a hired guard's shadow. She knew too well, if she left, someone else would bear that fear in her stead. Shut her door, and the wind would batter down another. Morning light cracked through her streaked window, pooling directly on her desk. The beam touched the threat note head-on, refusing to flinch. She turned her chair, eyes tracing the window she hadn't curtained for weeks. Outside, hundreds of faces still waited. A young mother, baby strapped to her chest, held a sign, "Thank you, Judge Ellis, no more silence." A teenager tugged down his school collar, revealing a fresh buzz cut like a living slogan, "We stand with her." Dorothy laid her palm on the glass, the same palm still etched with the hard ridges from that night she pounded her gavel to sign Brett's arrest. A cracked pane could break, but that crowd, hundreds of hands ready to knock at the door of justice, was the iron gate no threat could splinter. She pressed her lips tight, breath threading into the sunlight. Keep sending letters. When the wolves have to write to snarl, their teeth are already dull. And for the first time, Dorothy smiled. Not a weary smile, not bitter, but solid as a gavel strike on solid wood. The courthouse steps blazed white under noon sun, light bouncing off rows of camera lenses, flashing back from handmade signs screaming, "In Judge Ellis we trust." Everyone in that crowd knew, the moment those heavy doors swung open, they'd see the woman who turned disgrace into a mirror reflecting the rot everyone once feared to name. Dorothy Ellis stood in that doorway, robe severe yet unable to hide the stubborn patch of regrown hair, scarred scalp still raw under the sharp lenses. Reporters lunged close, mics pushed forward, flashes exploded like rain bursting over her head. She didn't flinch. Each step down the stone stairs was steady, unpaused, even when a little girl, maybe 8, slipped past the adult barricade, clutching a fistful of wildflowers bound with a frayed blue ribbon. The child looked up, shy but clear. "I want to give this for your hair. Mama said your hair hasn't grown back, but you look pretty even without it." Dorothy froze, then bent, pressing the flowers close to her chest. The wild petals fanned out small, sturdy, like the hands of children once terrified by Brett night after night. She crouched, her forehead touching the girl's, no promises, no vow to keep the flowers forever, just a gentle gaze. Thank you for trusting this head." Behind her, reporters missed nothing. The hashtag #TheBaldJudge flooded social feeds within minutes. People passed around clips of her hugging the flowers, snapshots of that imperfect scalp under unforgiving zoom, yet somehow stronger than any crown or polished judge's wig. The symbol needed no permission. Viral videos bloomed, law students chanting and shaving their fresh hair off one by one. A young nurse in the suburbs live-streamed her own buzz cut before her night shift, voice trembling. I stand with her. I stand with truth. Even a former cop tore off his badge, shaved his head in an empty lot, and left 3 words, "Forgive me, Ellis." No one waited for Dorothy's blessing. No one asked her to lead. They did it on their own, flaring up like dry grass catching fire aflame. Brett and his remaining wolves could never stomp out with a cheap threat or a hidden bullet in the dark. In the gust carrying the dry sun, Dorothy quietly reached out, gripping each hand extended toward her. Some sweaty, some shaking at the fear of cameras catching their faces, some squeezed hers quick, then yanked back, afraid their sudden courage might be seen. No two were alike, but each palm was a brick added to the wall, shielding this city's veins from the rats still scuttling beneath its storm drains. The young secretary stood nearby, file clutched tight to his chest, eyes wide with a faith he'd never dared picture in a judge once bowed under shame. He understood now. When someone mentioned Dorothy Ellis, no one would whisper, "That black woman they shaved bald." They'd say, "The woman who turned her shorn head into the hammer that nailed the wolves' hearts shut." When the crowd thinned, sunlight slid across the courthouse eaves, piercing the long corridor, the same hallway Brett Kellen once strode through in borrowed glory. Dorothy turned back, flowers firm in her grip, eyes sweeping the polished tile, free of blood, free of lurking shadows. No longer a lone woman dragging a file folder stuffed with Brett's bloody red marks. Now, every footfall was thousands walking beside her, signing, speaking, refusing dirty envelopes. At the courtroom door, she paused, lifted her chin to the high ceiling, her breath cracking free into a whisper, "Hair grows back, but justice, once it stands, will never bow again." When she pushed that heavy wooden door open, the light split wide, flooding the old stone floor. This path was no longer for one alone, but a broad road for every foot learning to step forward, side by side with justice, never lowering its gaze again. The trial that sentenced Brett Kellen ended without any cheers, only soft rounds of applause, then hurried footsteps mixed with the heavy slam of wooden doors. When the large courtroom door swung open to the harsh sun outside, the old wooden benches inside gradually emptied out. Reporters' notes, internal counsel's summaries lay scattered on the floor. Everyone rushed out, chasing the breaking news just detonated at the gate. On the last bench, near a wall mottled with peeling paint, a girl with neatly tied black hair still sat motionless. Mira Tran, a third-year student in criminal law, hugged a thin, dog-eared notebook to her chest, her black eyes shining straight at the now empty judge's bench. So many had run out, scrambling for mics, chasing cameras, hunting clickbait quotes from evaporating interviews. Only Mira remained, her face lit by fresh conviction yet shaded by a layer of gray uncertainty carved into her chest. Since she was 18, Mira believed justice was what fit neatly within textbooks' hypothetical casework, straight-A final papers that made her parents proud and professors nod in approval. She never believed a student like her could do anything beyond raising her hand to answer questions in an air-conditioned lecture hall. Her parents, having been hassled a few times by local police, always told her, "It's good enough you're smart, don't play hero. Lawyers only win on paper. A girl can't fight men with badges." But every reason to back down shattered today. Mira saw with her own eyes a woman, scalp patchy and raw, who dared stand steady inside a chamber brimming with power and violence, using her own humiliation to smash the smug face of an officer who thought himself untouchable. That woman didn't hide behind tall iron gates, nor retreat to a desk to sign warrants from afar. She stood there, scars exposed, enduring contemptuous stares that once sought to break her, and she won. Footsteps clicked lightly. Mira startled, looking up just as Dorothy Ellis strode down the narrow aisle between rows of benches. The judge had left the bench, left the camera flashes, and the reporters yelling her name out in the lobby. But when she passed Mira, she paused, just half a second, exactly the length of a breath brushing between their locked eyes. Dorothy looked at the young girl with an expression that asked no questions, offered no comfort, issued no orders. That look was a silent question. What did you see? And do you dare do anything about it? Mira held her gaze, not blinking, so as not to miss this fragment of mirror within the woman before her, a face furrowed with lines but not humiliation, a scalp ragged but lifted high like an accidental crown. A shiver raced down Mira's spine as she remembered the essay she had submitted at the end of her sophomore semester. The topic, law, a sword or a shield. Mira had eagerly written nearly 2,000 words, arguing that law was a shield to protect citizens, a barricade of rules to resist tyranny. Yet in 3 years, she never dared imagine herself wielding the sword. The sword was always for someone else, braver, harder, more reckless. Mira only knew how to hold the shield, to dodge the blade meant for her back. But the image of Dorothy rising after her public head shaving like an enemy's crude slash, and calmly exposing every lie, like a blade unsheathed among stale textbooks, made Mira ask herself, if she's not afraid to wield the sword, then what am I afraid of? Dorothy nodded slightly, her eyes swept away, as if handing Mira an invisible talisman. When she walked past, Mira bowed deeply, clutching her soft notebook tight to her chest, suppressing the tremor of a heart pounding hard against her ribs. The black robe brushed her shoulder heavy yet weightless. The warmth left by Dorothy's eyes slowly settled into a promise inside Mira's chest. If one woman dares stand alone, then I don't have to stand alone anymore. She rose from the last bench, stepping slowly through scattered notes, each step treading down an old layer of doubt. Ahead, the courtroom door gaped wide open, sunlight from the courtyard slanting across her back, pushing Mira beyond the shadow of fear that 3 years of law school never taught her how to shed. Night fell quickly over Dorm Block B of City Law School. Yellow street lamps drew pale halos on the patchy lawn littered with scraps of paper from student meetups that afternoon. In a third-floor room, Mira Tran curled on a swivel chair, back hunched, eyes still glazed with images from that morning's trial. Outside her cracked door, classmates murmured gossip, burst into laughter now and then, and someone shouted, "Hey, check out Judge Ellis's speech. She's badass." Mira didn't join in. Her laptop screen still glowed with the line, "Topic: Judicial Authority in Modern Society," a draft she'd been polishing for a week, just needing a few citations before sending it to her advisor. A safe essay, neat, guaranteed an A+, an essay that wouldn't ruffle feathers, stir the dust of power, or scrape at wounds hidden beneath courtroom tables. Mira's index finger froze on the backspace key. She stared at the old title, then inhaled. The words vanished, letter by letter, as if she were peeling off the good girl law student uniform everyone praised. She'll make a fine corporate counsel one day. A blank document opened. A new title appeared, neat but thorny. When justice knocks and pounds the table. Her fingers struck the keyboard furiously, thoughts tumbling behind her typing. I saw a shaved head harder than a pack of wolves' blades. I saw hands dragged through defamation still clutch the gavel to strike down crime. I saw law, not just printed in textbooks but alive, bleeding, losing hair, but never losing morality. Fellow law students, if we only learn the statute but not how to keep it clean, then law is dead before it ever reaches the courtroom. The essay had no greeting, no tidy closing for easy digestion. It was a fist, slammed on the table, the fist of a student still trembling, but now gripping justice instead of just polishing a CV for a cushy corporate law firm. Mira didn't sign her real name. She changed the format and sent it straight to the editorial board of the law school's student newspaper, adding a note, "If you're scared to publish it, don't keep it. But if you publish, don't edit a word." She didn't expect that just 3 hours later, before she could even nap off the jitters, her phone blew up with notifications of shares in the department's private group. Classmates commented, "Finally someone says what the rest of us are too scared to." A senior wrote, "Ellis showed me law still lives. This piece drives it home. Whoever wrote this, thank you." Mira didn't reply. She curled by the window, watching car headlights carve thin veins of light across the night sky like capillaries. In her mind, Dorothy Ellis standing firm beneath the bench, scarred scalp bare but eyes unbowed, flared like a tiny ember reigniting inside a student who had for too long just nodded and scribbled notes. That night, Mira gathered her closest friends. 4 of them, 3 guys and 1 girl, all notorious for skipping courtroom practice because they dreaded mock trials. Yet here they were, huddled in a bubble tea shop at the campus gate, plotting something big. "Mira, you sure about this? What group are we forming again?" She gripped her plastic cup fizzing with tapioca. Seed Force Clean Seeds. We start by offering free advice on small civil disputes for low-income folks. We practice investigating, rebutting, keeping the law clean from the tiniest clauses. Don't wait till we graduate and fear losing jobs to dare speak for justice. No one answered right away. Then one guy exhaled and nodded. In for a penny, in for a pound. If you're Seed Force, I'm Seed Force. They knocked fists together, laughter cracking in the chilly early summer night. Back in her room, Mira opened her notebook, adding a fresh blank page. She wrote one word carefully, Ellis. Nothing more, just the name enough to remind herself that justice doesn't need a will, just people brave enough to keep it alive, generation after generation. Before bed, she stepped out to the dorm courtyard, looking up at a city sky still smeared with haze, whispering to herself, a tree grows from a scar. A tree will pierce through dirty walls. Her hand snapped the notebook shut, heart beating quietly. Seed Force, a seed stirring awake, ready to break the earth and rise amidst the concrete jungle and the wolves who thought they ruled this darkness forever. This city's morning no longer feels damp and murky like the days when Dorothy Ellis stepped out into the streets with a scalp patchy from the rough shaving. Sunlight filters through the curtain of her small third-floor apartment, landing squarely on her face as she stands still before an old wall-mounted mirror. Her once ragged, short hair has now grown back evenly silver, each strand fluttering neatly like a soft armor covering the faint scar along her left temple. She lifts a hand, brushing lightly. Her fingertips scrape softly through the coarse hair, carrying the scent of cheap shampoo mixed with cinnamon, the same brand she'd used since her days as a rookie legal assistant. No fancy brushes, no foundation masking wrinkles, no dyed hair to hide her age, just a natural head of hair, both aged and proud. Dorothy's gaze meets her own in the mirror, a familiar face she has trained herself for decades to keep clean, like an eyeball shielded from political dust. She tilts her head slightly, brushing against memories of that night when Brett Kellen pressed a hair clipper to her scalp, its buzzing cold as a blade skinning flesh. That night, she smelled her own blood, the stench of humiliation hitting the back of her throat, choking the voice of justice she'd carried since graduation. A thin breath escapes her lips, falling into a whisper only the mirror can hear. Hair can fall out, but honor only falls when you pluck it out yourself. She smiles faintly, a smile that doesn't show white teeth, but reveals deep wrinkles, chasing each other toward her hairline. Outside the window, the city is still cramped with gray walls and car exhaust, but right across, the old wall once plastered with advertisements now beams with a fresh mural. A few law students had secretly erected scaffolding, pulling 2 all-nighters to paint her. Dorothy, with a shaved head, wielding the judge's gavel, at her feet, the broken Brett Kellen case file. Encircling the image are dozens of raised hands clutching copies of the Constitution, young hands, skinny hands, old hands, laborer hands, student hands of a crowd who had never known they too had the right to grasp justice tightly. She stares at the mural without blinking. A shaft of sunlight cuts through the doorframe, merging her shadow with that bald-headed Dorothy on the wall. A humiliation once nailed into her skin now stands high like a cross, deterring any lurking enemy. Brett is gone, but the lesson he left behind is carved deep like a hairline scar that will never fade. A tiny voice from the television slips into the still air. The announcer solemnly reads, "This morning, the Ministry of the Interior announced an expanded internal affairs inspection of the city's police force, adding 10% more to the vetting list and launching a secure hotline for anonymous whistleblowers. Community legal aid groups, including Seed Force and 2 others, have been licensed to provide free legal assistance directly in low-income neighborhoods." Dorothy closes her eyes, each word echoing like a gavel striking rhythmically on a courtroom bench. Months ago, this was just a distant dream, in nightmares laced with the smell of burning hair and Brett's mocking sneer, "As long as I wear this badge, who dares open their mouth?" But now, people are no longer afraid. They dare to speak up. They have somewhere to run, not a filthy holding cell, but the desk of students like Mira Tran filing complaints in her stead. She turns, glancing toward the corner of the room. In a small glass case atop her bookshelf sits her old judge's gavel, its wooden handle worn, the head bearing a hairline crack along its grain once gripped by Brett to smash files, hiding his name from paper trail. She taps a fingernail lightly on the glass. The sound is dull yet firm. This gavel was once a tool for wolves to hide their fangs, but since she struck it with her shaved head, it has returned to its true purpose, shattering deceit, awakening the silenced. A thin smile slices across her dry lips. Dorothy hears her own voice, low but solid as stone striking stone. Honor is clean now, and no one is strong enough to stain it again. Outside, the city still churns within its concrete ribcage, but beneath every gray brick, the sprouts of legal grass have rooted, watered by her hair scar, by Brett's blood, by the sweat of students pounding gavels onto paper, and this time, no wind will easily uproot it again. The small auditorium on the third floor of the old law faculty building is so quiet tonight that even the ceiling fans' clacking sounds clear as day. No media flashbulbs, no reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder. Only the familiar yellow lights shining down on dozens of young faces still soft in outline, but with eyes hardened by what this city has just witnessed. Dorothy Ellis sits on a wooden chair center stage, leaning back lightly, hands resting on the desk's edge, her patchy silver hair casting a shadow on the old tiled floor. No one asked her to prepare a speech, and there is no agenda directing where this forum might go. They simply invited her to come, to sit face to face with a generation that had never imagined shaving their heads for justice like she once did. Mira Tran sits in the front row, head slightly bowed, hands clutching a black hardcover notebook with Ellis, crudely cut and pasted from white paper. Each time Dorothy shifts her shoulder, Mira shifts too, eyes locked on the outline of that scarred hairline. To her, that scar shines brighter than any halo painted in textbooks about judicial authority. Dorothy speaks up, no mic pressed to her mouth. I once thought justice was these gray stone walls, this courthouse. My first 10 years as a lawyer, then 20 years as a judge, I was deluded that the gavel in my hand alone could break every lie. But I was wrong. She pauses, letting her breath fall into the thick tension. No one dares to tap their phones. Amateur cameras, hastily set up, forget to hit stop. All lenses remain fixed. A silver-haired woman, shoulders not broad but back stiff as ironwood, eyes piercing every row of seats. She points at the audience, her voice like rain drumming on an old tin roof. Justice lives inside every mind that knows how to wield a gavel, a pen, or a camera. Gavels can break, pens can run dry, cameras can be smashed, but your mind keeps them alive. Only when you nod in silence do the wolves swallow this building like a sugar cube in morning coffee. The ceiling fan stalls for a second, as if someone cut the power. Below, students sit with arms tight, palms sweaty. Some bite their pens, some tap fingers on the seat edge, some bury their faces in paper stacks, but their eyes blaze brighter than the tired yellow bulbs dangling overhead. Mira holds her breath. In her mind, Dorothy's gavel still pounds from Brett's trial, pounding hair blood into a crown, pounding shame into a living lesson. Her hand trembles. The Ellis notebook feels like it might crack under her grip. Dorothy's gaze sweeps over Mira, then across the packed rows of students. She uses no script, no slideshow, no backup speaker. She alone is enough, and she delivers one final question, not a conclusion, but a door she pushes open for this young generation to step through themselves. Today, I have lived long enough to rise from disgrace, to strike a gavel that forced a wolf to bow. But justice will die if you bow to it. If you were me, if tomorrow you carried the head I once carried, what would you do? A silence stretches like a black hole devouring all sound. Mira inhales deeply, eyelids flickering, hand lowering her notebook to her thigh, the other gripping the wooden seat. She knows this question is not just for her, but no one is allowed to dodge it by sitting still as mere spectators anymore. A young man's voice breaks from the back of the hall, not loud but steady as bedrock. I would do what you did, or more. The answer falls, needing no applause, no praise. It simply dissolves into the air like a sprout, cracking its shell, pushing through concrete that long stifled wild grass roots. Dorothy closes her eyes for a heartbeat. In her mind, the mural outside the courthouse reappears, the bald head gleaming under sunlight, surrounded by hands that once knew no power but now know how to clutch belief. The yellow light spills out, casting long streaks across the students' shoulders. No formal adjournment needed. Each one stands on their own, carrying in their heart an unanswered question. If you were Dorothy, what would you do? This story reminds us, never box someone in based on shallow judgment. Talent and resolve never fit neatly into rumors, and justice always finds its way to win when there are people brave enough to keep it standing tall. Have you ever been misjudged because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, yet quietly proved yourself stronger than they thought? If this story touches you, share it so more people can awaken, and don't forget to follow this channel for more stories where justice has a voice.